In the 22nd century, modern people, bored with many pleasures, find salvation in virtual games. The reason for this is very simple. Advanced virtual technologies make it possible to feel as if you are controlling your own body. Today, thanks to the 5th generation, stimulation touches the 5 senses of a person and is therefore difficult to resist. Lahoen, an experienced gamer, now has free time to play the new game and explore it from all sides. However, by this evening, he wanted to stop playing virtual games because in the previous version of the game, he had reached 97 in the morning. The developers couldn't let such an experienced player go so easily, so they even sent him a headset to keep him going. As soon as he started to connect, he was already identified in a matter of seconds, and then a message appeared about the transfer of rating points. Carefully examining the new location, the young man saw that it had expanded quite a bit and looked different from the very beginning. The next message outraged the young man a bit because all his points from the previous game were exchanged for this one at a fairly low cost. Next, we had to create a character, but there were some problems here too because everything became quite complicated, but the player did not intend to give up. That's why I decided to choose an advanced premium email, which costs quite a bit of money. To clarify the payment, the system issued a message asking whether the guy was ready to pay $3 million, to which he immediately replied yes. When creating the character, the guy decided to name himself something respectable, so in the City of Mazes, his name will be Wilhelm Meyer. The gamer spent a few more minutes setting everything up, and then after synchronization, he found himself in the city of Brahm on a street near the market. When the locals saw the newcomer, they froze in their tracks because he did not look like them at all and therefore stood out from the crowd. He was dressed in metal clothing and had a long, dark cloak hanging behind him, with the hood pulled over his head to hide his face. As soon as he saw a girl next to him, he abruptly grabbed her arm, which scared the young lady, and she tearfully asked him to let her go. The man did not pay attention to these pleas at all, instead asking to see where the guild was located, and the lady said that she would show him only when she was released. All the other people on the square were outraged by this behavior in broad daylight, and these recruits were quite different from them. A few minutes later, a burly man in a black cape returned to his interlocutor and said that he had found out the location of the guild. As soon as they started walking, people started calling the new guy a low-level bastard who for some reason was dragging a small, useless guy along with him. For some reason, they decided that this duo made no sense and that they and their presence here would be of no use. After a few minutes of traveling, the two men and the young lady found themselves in the most abandoned places of the city of Brahm. As they walked, the young man looked at his strong partner and couldn't understand at what point everything went wrong. Because this man looks like the final boss of the demon world, but now he's his assistant, on whom he used all his achievements in the last game. About an hour ago, when creating this character, the guy bought rare skills and characteristics that he thought would be useful. Then he added unique equipment and rare armor to make people believe that he was a fairly experienced player. The young man considered himself not an ordinary player, but a very good one, and therefore he knew how to create a useful assistant whom he could later improve. So this time he decided to go against the grain and spend all his savings on his ally. The gamer was 100% sure that there was no such person who would have come to the same decision he had long ago. Looking at his ward, the young man realized that he looked quite scary, but there was a plus that he would obey his every word. However, after looking a little closer and in more detail, the young man came to the conclusion that he had overdone it a bit with the settings because he looked very scary. However, the message is that as soon as loyalty falls below a certain point, the subordinate simply stops following orders. But the worst thing is that they may not recognize their owner and may leave him, so the player should be careful here. Stopping in his tracks, the young man closed his eyes and tried to imagine the worst-case scenario that could happen due to the slightest flaw. Opening his eyes, the player realized that he was not in the best position in this game, and at that moment, a guy had already appeared behind him. As soon as he approached the young man, he immediately began to attack him, and the victim did not like it because he did not have very good characteristics. Therefore, he simply fell to the ground from this attack, which caused his companions to stop and look directly at him. The subordinate did not hesitate to approach his boss and, holding out his hand, offered him to come up and asked if he was okay. As soon as they held hands, the system issued a message that the player Wilhelm Meyer was using his assistant. As long as they continued to stand in the same position, the system reported that the random relationship would be established automatically. A few minutes later, it became known that the subordinate considered his boss to be a rather charismatic person who had something good in him. However, this can end when the guy fails to meet the requirements, and then the worst-case scenario for him starts. At the last message, the young man froze in place with a frightened expression, because he realized that he was in a bad situation now. The gamer didn't fully understand how to act, so he turned to his subordinate and ordered him to go after the attacker. The man went off to fulfill the order with a big smile on his face, while his boss remained standing there and silently watched him go. Despite all this, he still could not believe that this scary-looking man was his assistant who listened to all his requests. Suddenly, this silence was broken by a young lady who sneezed loudly while standing next to the player and looking at him intently. Wilhelm couldn't understand why this girl was looking at him as if he were some kind of disgusting garbage, and then he remembered that she didn't look at his subordinate like that. So he came closer and looked the young lady in the eye and said that his client was more competent than he looked. The young man then emphasized that if she values her life, she should make sure that she doesn't look at him with such a miserable look. The player in the middle was very angry and annoyed by people who underestimated them from the very beginning without even knowing their capabilities. The girl was so upset that she could not speak normally, but she took out a gold coin from her pocket and handed it to the other person. When the guy saw it, he waved his hand and told her to keep it, because that kind of money could only buy a piece of apple. Suddenly, this conversation was interrupted by the system, which issued a message that the gamer's subordinate had already completed the task and caught the thief. This made the young man very happy, because he realized that his assistant was really competent in such matters, so it would be easier for them to work together in the future. When the player saw his subordinate, he froze in place with his mouth open in surprise, and the girl froze in fright. And this reaction was because a large man in a black cloak tied the thief to his sword with a rope and carried him upside down. Then the system began to issue notifications about various developments, either to make friends with the criminal or simply to get useful information from him. Stopping not far from his boss, the gentleman in black lowered his sword to the ground and said that he wanted to blame the little thief for such actions. The young lady who was with them began to cry, covering her face with her hands, and the young man who was in charge began to break out in a cold sweat from fear. A subordinate noticed these concerns and approached the manager, asking why he was shaking so much and whether there was another problem. The gamer was confused because if he shows someone his weakness, which cannot belong to the manager, the assistant will stop serving him. So, gathering all his will into a fist, the man raised his eyebrows and asked in a rude tone what kind of shameful job the young man had chosen. This reaction of the boss amused the subordinate, and he even froze in place for a second, because it proved to him that he was exactly where he should be. Then he said that he had no witnesses at all, so he did not have to worry that the boy would tell anyone about what had just happened. The gamer said in confusion that he could not take the child's life for such an act, so he could not even understand what to do. The subordinate raised his right hand to his beard and began to think about what this little boy could be thinking at such a moment. Suddenly, he opened his eyes sharply and said that the child wanted to find out where the boss was staying and take everything valuable he had. Then something strange happened for all those present, as the assistant chief began to bend the criminal's head and apologize on his behalf for what he had done. After that, the system issued a notification that the subordinate had received an emergency fund in the amount of 200 gold coins, which were already in his hands. This novelty made the gamer and the young lady standing next to him wonder why this assistant was given so much money. Suddenly, the boy spoke and said that today he had seen many rich people because when the gate opened, a large number of searchers came rushing in. The player concluded that this boy had stolen everyone's startup capital, so he would take the quest from him one day. So I came closer to him and leaned over and asked him if he was going to continue stealing money, and the young man replied that he would not do it again. This answer did not satisfy the man, so he leaned directly to his right ear and added that this was not what he wanted to hear. And then he asked what exactly he was stealing the money for, since he had a sick mother at home who needed treatment and hungry younger brothers and sisters. Without hearing a word from the young man, the gentleman continued to assume that it could be hooligans who were forcing him to do this. Finally, he added that he would help the boy find a decent job after helping him get out of this black hole. The thief was still silent, which angered the assistant chief, and he pulled his shirt and said that his boss wanted the young man to pay him taxes. After a short pause, the gentleman in black added that his boss wanted 90% of the profits the boy was making. The young man folded his hands as if in prayer, crying bitterly, and began to assure him that he would not steal again and ask for forgiveness. These words made the subordinate even more angry, so he waved his sword and said angrily that they did not need people who would not be useful. The boy was very frightened, so he fell to the ground and said that he would try to do everything in his power, but in return, he asked to spare his life. After these words, all the intimidation stopped, and the boy even tried to stand up. But the boss was shocked by the behavior of his assistant, to put it mildly. In a few minutes, the system began to issue notifications that the thief would pay taxes, and a new skill called charisma was available for the player. Even the young lady noticed it, but the man did not like it. As soon as they moved on, the assistant enthusiastically began to say that he was very proud of his boss because they now had 200 ancient coins. The player walking behind his subordinate turned to him and said that half of these coins would belong to him because he deserved it. The gentleman in black thanked him cautiously, and this reaction surprised the boss a bit because he expected to hear a little different words, but it will be as it is. After several hours of traveling, the girl suddenly stopped in her tracks and turned her gaze to her leaders and said that the guild house was in front of him. You could see the surprise on the men's faces, because the room they saw in front of them did not look like its status. The gamer was shocked, because usually the Adventurers Guild is a tall building located in the very center of the city, and this is some kind of a ruin. As the girl cautiously went inside, the man still couldn't understand how the main building of the guild could be so shabby. The lighting inside was rather poor, but you could see that several tables were occupied by companies of formidable men. As soon as they noticed that someone had come to visit them, they put aside all their work and began to watch the newcomers closely. The first person to enter was the boss's subordinate, and his appearance alerted everyone present and thus forced them to remain silent for several minutes. As soon as the assistant stopped, he looked around and asked what these bastards were looking for, or maybe they just wanted to die. The player froze behind his subordinate with his mouth wide open in fear because he clearly did not expect such a setup to be waiting for them. When he came to a little bit of consciousness, he turned his head to the young lady and asked her in surprise where she had actually led them. The girl was a little confused by this reaction and began to clarify whether this was exactly what they were looking for, because she had led them to a group of robbers. As soon as the young lady finished her sentence, the player simply exploded with anger because he was counting on a completely different course of events than it is now. The bartender of this establishment calmly wiped his glasses, greeted the guests, and asked what they wanted to order from him. The girl who brought them here kept making excuses for the fact that she really misunderstood where the newcomers were supposed to go. While the boss was listening to all this, all the thoughts in his head began to mix, and in order to put everything together, he closed his eyes and put his hand on his forehead. After a short pause, the subordinate turned to the boss and asked if he always approached things so boringly, and said that it was time to get rid of the lady. The guy was a little confused by this idea because he was not ready to take the lives of his colleagues so drastically, so he froze for a few seconds. However, he clearly understood that there was no time to hesitate because his assistant could smell weakness and leave him alone right then and there. So he put his hands behind his back and said that they could not just attack the population in the middle of the day, because then they would have problems with the authorities. And they don't need this right now. The gentleman turned his gaze to the interlocutor and asked if he understood everything, or if he needed to clarify something. The man in black analyzed all the words said by his boss and looked in front of him and calmly answered everything well. However, a second later, he turned menacingly to the girl who had come with them and told her to leave immediately and not to catch their eye again. The young lady was so frightened that she quickly ran out of the room with her hands over her eyes, and without looking back, she quickly went home. A player was looking at her, and it was because he felt a little sorry for her because she hadn't come here of her own free will and was treated like that. Then the guy mentioned that he had only once felt sorry for a girl and met her in a game, but now the world has become bigger and it is unlikely that he will ever meet her again. When the bartender finished wiping the glasses, he turned to the newcomers and asked them if they wanted to join the guild. The assistant boss answered without hesitation that this was exactly why they had come here, but such a determination of the player's friend surprised me. The other men present, looking at the guests, speculated out loud that it was likely that the alleys would become even more uneasy now. As soon as the two newcomers approached the bar, the bartender looked at them carefully and informed them that the entrance fee was 5 gold coins. But then he said that since they had just arrived, they probably had only 1 gold coin and told them to come back when they earned the right amount. However, the gentleman did not even have time to finish his thought before the player's subordinate took out a small bag and loudly put the required number of coins on the table. Then the bartender had no choice but to give the men a wooden token, proving that they were members of the town's guild. The assistant chef decided that they were trying to cheat them and asked if this piece of wood was worth as much as 5 gold coins. As soon as everyone present heard these words, they were shocked, to put it mildly, that an outwardly formidable man was somehow serving a snotty little boy. Then the room became a mess, as everyone tried to explain why these two could be in such a relationship. Then the guild members began to discuss why this boss was dressed in rags and suggested that he wanted to pass himself off as a newcomer. However, the assistant did not let these words go unchallenged, as he was not ready to hear such dirty words about his boss. So he went to the scene. As soon as he approached the man who had said these bad words, he looked frightened at the man in black standing next to him. The player's subordinate wasn't even going to say anything. He just silently swung his right hand and struck his boss's offender in the face. It was so strong that the victim fell from the chair to the floor and his nose started bleeding, which he tried to stop with his hand. After that, the gamer's assistant said that no one dared to discuss his boss, and then added that he had already been delivered by this viper. The man just could not contain his rage. His eyes began to glow red, and he said out loud that he just wanted to destroy everyone here. And immediately, after saying these words, the subordinate reached for his sword, which was on his back at the time, because it was more convenient to carry it. Suddenly, the boss intervened in this fight and loudly called out to his assistant to draw his attention to himself for an explanation. As soon as the gentleman in black looked at the chief, he heard him trying to explain that the slums have completely different laws than they do. Then there was a short pause between them, after which the gamer raised his eyebrows and emphasized that they both had to follow them. It was difficult for the subordinate to admit that he should calm down and leave everything as it was, but he had no other choice, so he agreed to the request. As soon as the man turned his back on the victim, other gentlemen ran up to him and began to ask if he needed any help. The assistant continued to try to ignore the way everyone in the room was looking at him and stood at the bar next to the chef. Then they both turned to the so-called bartender and said that since they were already here, perhaps there was already a task for them. And in a matter of seconds, the newcomers were presented with the tasks of the criminal guild, among which they could choose the one they liked best. After reviewing several tasks, the player concluded that the rewards here are so-so and the quests do not look fast. He still managed to choose a task, and it was to collect debts from people from whom he could shake a little more than he needed. The bartender listened attentively and said that Hans, who knew the shortest way to get there, would take the men to the workplace. When this Hans approached the newcomers, he told them that he only works for money, so he was not going to teach them for free. A second later, he added that the first rule of the guild is that nothing is free, and he himself is a person who owes the guild a large amount of money. The boss did not like the fact that this guide was a freeloader and not a normal guild worker, but he had no choice but to agree. In just a minute, the three of them were on the street near the town's market, and the guide asked the newcomers to keep up. Then he turned around and began to walk to his destination, smiling, followed by his assistant and only then by his supervisor. After walking a few meters, the subordinate turned to his boss and said that, as usual, he had chosen a fairly profitable business on which to make a good living. The player listened carefully to this suggestion and stopped with his eyes wide open because he could not understand what his friend meant. The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't leave him anywhere because he could create a lot of problems for them that would need to be solved. In order for everything to go smoothly, the boss asked the assistant to behave respectfully and not jump to conclusions or make quick decisions. The subordinate listened attentively, but did not say anything in response, only smiled mysteriously, which alarmed the manager. However, he did not have time to think about it, because they were approached by a guide who had already opened the door to the building and said that they had arrived. He was the first to go inside, and behind him, newcomers were already crawling. A burly man was sitting at the entrance and greeting them. In the first few minutes, the boss managed to see the goods in this store and realized that it was not ordinary at all because the things were valuable. As soon as the owner realized that they were not ordinary customers, he irritably asked why they had come to him again and what they wanted. The man's name was Bill, and he owed the guild a lot of money, so he immediately assumed that the guild could have sent these people. When Hans saw the seller's hands, he told him to take them away from him, and then told his colleagues that this gentleman always does this when they are supposed to come. The player's subordinate decided to intervene at this point, so he put his hand on the leader's right shoulder and urged him to move a little to the side. The assistant then turned to his supervisor and said that he would do what he was asked to do, namely, follow the laws of the guild. The gamer didn't have time to say anything to these words because his friend began to walk slowly but surely toward the shop owner. But Hans was a little surprised by the way the black-haired guy was addressed by this thug, so he turned to face him and wanted to hear some explanation. However, he never heard anything in response, while his subordinate and the salesperson started the conversation on a good and relaxed note. They even shook hands, but it took a while, and the assistant began to smile strangely, which alerted the building owner. And then he realized what the mockery meant, because the newcomer squeezed the other man's hand so hard that he even yelped and closed his eyes from the sharp pain. A few minutes later, the seller began to scream loudly, and it was as if an electric shock had spread throughout his body, causing him great suffering. At first, the victim fell to his knees, and then, in an instant, he collapsed face first into the ground, and a cloud of dust rose around him. After that, the system immediately issued a message that Bill, who owed a large amount of money to the guild, was lying without signs of life. When the boss realized everything, he was very frightened because he had a subordinate with him who could take a person's life with just a handshake. A few minutes later, the system issued a new message saying that they had received 350 gold coins as a percentage of the debt. Immediately after that, the men returned to the guild building and approached the so-called bartender and put all the coins they had earned on the table. The man was not prepared for the newcomers to cope with the task so quickly, so he did not even know how to react. Seeing the confusion on the interlocutor's face, the boss said that they hadn't touched anything in the store and added that they would have to deal with the consequences themselves. After all this, the system informed them that the task of collecting taxes was completed and they received the money plus a tenfold contribution to the guild. The bartender did not answer anything. He continued to stand in the same position, and the system reported that he was very wary of both of them. The gamer also began to look closely at the man across from him and could not understand why he was looking at them so suspiciously after completing the task. Then he began to assume on his own that this could be because they had taken the debtor's life and taken all his money, although they should have left him alive. Suddenly, the bartender broke his silence and said that the newcomers could be sent into the maze right now and they would be able to handle it without any problems. Then the man asked a question to find out why they had spent such effort in vain, since she was only causing problems here. The boss's subordinate, gritting his teeth in irritation, replied that his boss wanted him to do this, so he simply did not need any other reasons. Suddenly, Hans interrupted the conversation and asked if they could choose another job and leave this one for those who still needed to feed their families. The player looked at the gentleman who addressed him and calmly replied that he did not like the other tasks at all, so he chose this one. Then the bartender said that he knew they had money, so he was willing to raise them 10 gold coins for 2. The boss's subordinate, without thinking about the proposal for a long time, took out the required number of coins and threw them on the counter right in front of the interlocutor. The man quickly checked to see if all the money was there and then took out the round metal badges worn by all official members of the guild. The bartender then explained that they are enchanted so that they can recognize everyone. Plus, they can be used to develop the skills and abilities of the guild. They also cost a contribution to the guild, so it's better to hide these badges so that some vigilant citizen can't see them and complain. As soon as the chef reached out to take the badge, the bartender sharply replied that it was too early because he was just showing them off. This attitude made the manager very angry, and he began to think about why they decided to mock them and why they were organizing this circus. To show his anger, he leaned on the counter with both hands and stared intently into the eyes of the man who told him that he needed to enter their data. The bartender decided to correct the situation and said that he shouldn't look at him like that because he was only joking, and then said that he would tell us about the accommodation. However, it was not as simple as he had imagined because the boss's subordinate grabbed him by the shirt and demanded an explanation for the joke. Of course, the gentleman was afraid for his life because he knew what these two could do, so he told them that they could live there completely free of charge. However, even this did not calm the assistant down. He was more concerned that the man had allowed himself to mock his boss so brazenly. The boss began to look at his companion carefully, and the thought flashed through his mind that he wouldn't mind hearing about free housing. At that moment, a criminal man in black shone his eyes with a bright light and told the bartender to apologize for his bad joke. And a second later, he added that if he still wanted to live a little longer, he should try to apologize, because he had no right to speak to his boss like that. After these words, there was a short pause between them, and the two men looked each other intently in the eyes, while the player tried to guess what might happen next. After this pause, the bartender asked the attacker the following question, asking if he didn't think that such actions were too much. Of course, the boss's subordinate didn't like this, so he got even angrier and began to clarify what was going on. And literally in 1 second, he instantly drew his sword and struck the counter on the right side of his interlocutor, and it cracked in half. A cloud of dust rose in the room as part of the table collapsed to the floor, and the player was shocked to see how everything unfolded. But the other men present decided that it was too dangerous to be here now, so they began to head for the exit without looking back. After that, the bartender realized that he had no other option but to apologize for being rude to the newcomers. The assistant did not like the fact that the man was apologizing while looking at him, so he angrily emphasized that this should be done with his boss. The gentleman quickly turned his head to the gamer and looked him in the eye and hastily apologized for the way he had joked about him. The black-clad attacker didn't even like that, so he leaned even closer to the bartender and asked why he could hear sincerity in his words. The man suddenly pulled out a bag with an inscription of 100 gold coins on it and offered it as an apology for having humiliated them somehow. When the system gave a message that they had indeed received this amount, the boss was surprised that they had earned so much money in one go. Then he closed his eyes and, smiling sweetly, began to think that if people would apologize to him so constantly, it could be quite profitable. At this time, the assistant was quietly watching his boss's reaction, and he was unable to correctly decipher his attitude to the money offered. So he angrily grabbed the bartender's shirt and angrily emphasized that his boss was not happy because he did not hear the sincerity in the gentleman's words. The player just grabbed his head because he didn't understand how this was possible and wished it was over. The man who was supposed to apologize was confused and agitated, so he decided that he would take advantage of the last offer. And in a second, a sword appeared in the air with a double-sided sharpening, and the advantage is that it adds 3 times the strength to the owner. When the gamer picked up this weapon, he emphasized that this sword was well sharpened and also very enchanted. Putting it in front of him, he assumed that it could cut 2 centimeters longer than its end, so it was a great weapon for close combat. While he was examining the weapon closely, the bartender and his subordinate were watching him and trying to figure out whether he liked it or not. The reaction was not long in coming, as the assistant exploded again and turned his head sharply to the bartender to make a complaint. The boss couldn't understand this, because he was happy with all the gifts, but for some reason his partner behaved quite the opposite. The gentleman in the black cloak grabbed his sword and began to threaten the bartender with it, saying that he wanted to pay them off with some trifles. The manager could no longer restrain himself because his mind was raging with thoughts that he was completely satisfied with everything, but his assistant was now ruining everything. Suddenly, the assistant angrily told this impudent gentleman that it was time to say goodbye to his head because he did not know how to behave with them. And immediately after saying these words, the attacker swung his sword to demonstrate the seriousness of his intentions. However, he failed to hit the bartender because an interesting weapon appeared from the ceiling and became an obstacle to the attack. When the attacker felt that he could not fulfill his intention, he opened his eyes in surprise to see what had prevented him from doing so. Then a hatch opened in the ceiling, through which a girl looked out and addressed all those present and asked questions to find out what was going on. It was the young lady who was able to stop the blow with her sword. She had rather delicate features and long brown hair. The subordinate was not at all frightened or surprised by her appearance, so he looked her straight in the eye and told her to just disappear. The lady continued to hang upside down, saying that a real spear had appeared in the guild, and so she asked the question to find out his name. The interlocutor did not know how to talk to girls, so he rudely replied that his name was Caesar and then asked what her name was. The young lady closed her eyes and mockingly replied that her name was Lena, and then called the interlocutor His Majesty based on his name. After that, the room fell silent because no one knew how to react to this, and none of them understood how to properly end this fight. The only one who became very worried was the boss, who could not understand how she could talk to his psychotic assistant in such a tone. The reaction of the gentleman in the black cloak was not long in coming, so he turned to the girl menacingly and told her to just disappear. The lady put her hand to her head and asked why he asked her name if he didn't ask her for it anyway, but called her as he pleased. The gamer froze in place in shock, because he could not foresee what could happen to the girl after her subordinate had warned her several times. Then the guy concluded that Caesar had come a long way in the past and could probably identify a strong opponent with a single glance. And from this, the player realized that this young lady could be strong, and even several times stronger than Caesar, since he was in no hurry to attack. And just a second later, the thought flashed through my mind that she might be from the very top of the guild, so she could behave so arrogantly with them. Then the gentleman analyzed her appearance and was surprised by her reaction and wondered how much skill she had. After all, as he knows, his assistant has 20% strength and 10% dexterity and cannot be called slow at all. However, dexterity is responsible not only for speed, but also for dynamic visual acuity and reflexes, and at this time, the girl was going down to the floor. When the guy saw that these two were going to fight, he realized that at the beginning of the game, he didn't want to risk anything against such an opponent. Then the player bent his head down a little in sadness, because he did not understand that he could not just retreat, because then he would lose Caesar's loyalty. But all he had to do was try to settle the matter somehow, so he addressed the young lady in a calm tone. He did not succeed in doing so, because he had confused her name from the very beginning, and therefore began to beat himself up a bit in his head for it. However, he pulled himself together and asked in a serious tone of voice if the seller made a mistake. Who was to blame, himself or the store where he worked? The girl, holding her chin, began to think at first, and then asked if the interlocutor was trying to complicate things. The player began to explain what he meant by this, saying that if the employee was guilty, the client could complain about him and receive an apology. At this point, everyone listened to him attentively, and as soon as he finished speaking, he clarified whether he was saying everything correctly, and he addressed this to the lady. Without answering, the young lady sharply swung her weapon, and with a single blow, managed to take away 2 badges from the bartender who was standing next to her. All those present were shocked by such actions, and therefore stood silently in their seats, waiting for the girl to explain why she had done so. And she did. Demonstrating one of the badges, the young lady smiled broadly, and emphasized that if they had this thing, they were already members of the guild. Then she paused for a moment and asked a question to find out why she was talking about sellers and customers. And then the lady emphasized that they have not yet been officially hired, so they are ordinary workers who can be entrusted with cleaning windows or floors at the moment. At first, her husband could not respond to this because she emphasized quite logical things, and they could not do anything about it yet. However, inside, the gamer was torn to pieces with anger because this girl had hurt his pride, which he had not been able to violate for a long time. So he decided to show that he was not such a simple beginner, and showed her a bag of gold coins, and asked where she had seen such a janitor. The interlocutor was shocked, to put it mildly, and you could see it on her face. Her eyes were wide open, and her mouth was watering. After collecting some money, she said that this money would be enough to run their own shop, and asked why they would work for the guild in the first place. When the last men were leaving the room, the boss said in a serious tone that all big stores have their own secrets. Then he again demonstrated a bag of coins and added that these secrets are experience and knowledge that no amount of money can buy. The young lady was simply fascinated by these words and began to smile broadly because she had never heard such words from anyone before. So she came closer to the player and looked him straight in the eye and said it was a cool idea, and then asked him a question to find out his name. The guy didn't drag his feet and immediately told me that his name was Wilhelm Meyer. The lady happily said that his name sounded cool too. After these words, the girl's behavior changed a bit. She became softer, and a second later added that she was starting to like the guy a lot. Then she held the tip of her sword right up to the face of her subordinate boss, and smilingly said that she would simply not interfere in this. The bartender was disappointed with the lady's behavior, and asked her if she was refusing to fulfill her duties as a guild protector. Lena began to walk back to where she had come from, and the gentleman asked her if she really thought she could get away with such actions, and she confirmed his guess. After that, she said that he was stupid and worthless, and she was smart and talented, and it's not hard to conclude who is more loved in the guild. After saying the last phrase, the young lady quickly closed the door in the ceiling behind her, and the bartender looked at her confused and disappointed for a few seconds. He didn't have time to explain anything to the newcomers because Caesar swung his sword and dealt a fatal blow to the man who had caused them so much trouble. Immediately afterwards, the system issued a message that Caesar's notoriety had risen by 10% and Wilhelm Meyer's by 20%. The player could not fully understand why his subordinate had destroyed this man, but he calmly said that now the boss could be calm. On the same day, the young lady who was responsible for helping in the guild was lying on the floor near the hatch, drinking a strong drink and thinking that it was a very boring job. From below, she could hear the voices of men she thought were worthless, who did nothing but drink, play, and make dirty jokes about girls every day. Lena couldn't believe that she was spending all day here to protect these impudent people in case of any attack on them. She found this task very boring and began to regret having invested in the guild's fortunes and now having to do this kind of work. Suddenly, however, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud thud that Caesar hit the counter next to the bartender, and she realized that she had to make sure that everything was okay. When the young lady looked through a small crack in the ceiling, she noticed that there was some strange running around in the room, including two newcomers. Caesar was the first to attract her attention because he was very angry, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural red light. When she heard the phrase that the bartender should apologize not to her but to his boss, the lady was surprised to hear it at all. It was wild to hear that such a thug had a superior to whom he obeyed and fulfilled all his requests and orders. Then the girl turned her gaze to the gamer and carefully examined him and emphasized that this gentleman looked like an ordinary guy who was very tired. Lena was also surprised that the so-called boss was wearing some kind of rags, but she couldn't analyze it for long because her colleague was already giving her a bag of coins. After seeing this, the young lady turned her gaze back to the manager and tried to understand by his expression whether everything would be resolved normally. However, the guy's facial expressions changed abruptly and he seemed to be upset. Caesar also noticed this and demanded a sincere apology from the bartender. After that, the guild member pulled out a cool sword, and Lena waited for the boss to give her some kind of positive reaction, so she sat quietly for a few seconds. At first, he seemed pleased, but in a few minutes, his expression changed dramatically. He raised his eyebrows and looked disappointed. Of course, this reaction was also seen by the subordinate, who turned to the bartender again and tried to get an apology for his boss. The girl was shocked, to put it mildly, that the assistant intended to take the life of a guild member, as it was tantamount to self-destruction. Therefore, when Caesar tried to strike his interlocutor with his sword, the young lady decided to intervene in this dispute. Of course, at first Lena behaved quite confidently and professionally, but when the boss showed her a bag with a tidy sum of money, she was confused. And in a matter of seconds, Caesar's supervisor began to explain to the girl that no experience and knowledge can be bought for money. With these words and his self-confidence, he bribed the girl, and she stood there like a spellbound and believed everything he told her. Therefore, at some point, she raised her sword and, smiling broadly, said that she had decided not to interfere in this fight. As it turned out later, the player has such a sad and tired look because of poor synchronization with a real person from the real world. However, now Caesar's act, which he did not think through, will lead to very large and possibly very unpleasant consequences for both of them. The boss began to think that if the guild members decided to take revenge for their comrade, his assistant would not be able to cope with them alone. The guy looked at his partner anxiously and summarized for himself that things had not gone well from the very beginning. So he decided to talk to his subordinate about what he had just done and emphasized that he always does what he wants and what he decides. Caesar began to smile broadly, saying that he should have realized that this would not be enough to lessen his master's anger. And a second later, he added that he should have asked the bartender and then found his family and done the same to them, and then it would have satisfied everyone. The player simply didn't know how to talk to his assistant anymore because he understood some parts of the conversation correctly and some parts not. Suddenly, Lena interrupted their conversation, peeking out of the hatch and saying that Caesar's boss was a real monster whom she had never seen before in her life. When the gamer turned his gaze to the interlocutor, he was surprised that she turned and assumed that the lady had come to report them. The subordinate angrily emphasized that it had long been obvious to him that his boss was a great man who would destroy this world in the near future. As soon as he heard these words, his mind was a mess of thoughts, full of anger at his friend who was always talking nonsense. In a matter of seconds, the girl came down to them and told them that she was only 16 years old, that she was killing people and had ties to the guild. After finishing her presentation, the young lady turned to Caesar and asked him if his boss needed such a nugget. When the player listened to all this carefully, he could not put together how she could be so naive and take people's lives at the same time. So he folded his arms across his chest and asked her in a serious tone of voice if she had heard everything she had said a few seconds ago. Then the girl pointed her index finger at her subordinate and said that she finally understood why this burly maniac was following all the guy's orders. The gamer was just beside himself with disappointment because he didn't want this girl to join them because he couldn't handle them both. Lena did not pay attention to the guy's reaction at all. Instead, she asked him if he had really decided to set up his black office right here. Without waiting for an answer, she raised her sword in the air and joyfully said that this organization would become the best in the town. After that, the young lady came up to the boss and looked him straight in the eye and told him that she wanted to work for him from that moment on. After a short pause, the lady added that she was informing him that she usually works at a fixed rate and nothing else. Mentally, the player replied to the girl that he would not have anything to do with her because he had enough of Caesar, and therefore she should achieve everything herself. This time, Lena also did not wait for an answer and began to smile happily to herself, saying that she was a member of their team. The system immediately issued a message that the guy had managed to recruit a criminal, and for this, he received 3% of his charisma. The only thing the boss could not understand was how she could fit into their team if he had clearly and explicitly told her that he did not want to give her any opportunity. When he looked at her, he concluded that this girl was just Caesar, wearing a short leather skirt. A few hours later, they reached the city square, where the system clarified that members could add themselves to their team without the consent of the leader. The boss walked in front with his head down, followed by a subordinate who asked if the lady would be able to handle the task. The guy said that he didn't need to worry about her because he thought she could never find them in this big world. The two partners walked on in silence, but the thought flashed through the manager's mind that he was tired, even though he hadn't done anything today. And he already knows that this man will behave so viciously in the Adventurers Guild because in his mind, there is no limit to his communication with others. After this one incident, his character may simply disappear, and his relationship with Caesar will come to an end, and the game will be over for him. So he decided that he couldn't just watch his subordinate, on whom he had spent all his savings for 10 years, turn into an NPC. Suddenly, the assistant stopped and looked at his boss and said that he was looking at him as if he wanted to ask him something. Next, their attention was drawn to a little red-haired girl standing alone, crying loudly for her mother, whom she must have lost. The supervisor turned his gaze to his subordinate and asked him if he also saw a little girl crying in the middle of the town square. After a short pause, the man asked the assistant the following question to find out what he wanted to do when he saw her like that. The gentleman in the black cloak looked at the object that attracted their attention and stood silently considering it because he needed to think it over. The girl still continued to cry loudly, standing in one place, and all the people who passed by did not pay any attention to her. Caesar suddenly raised his index finger to the level of her chest and sneeringly said that the boss really wanted to force her to beg. The player was upset again because his partner has no good qualities at all. He is full-blown evil in his big body. However, he did not intend to give up so easily, so he said that he did not want to hear about himself, but wanted to hear what the assistant wanted to do. After these words, the black-cloaked man thought about them and took a few minutes to respond. Then, without saying anything to his boss, he began to walk slowly toward the girl, who was still standing there, calling out loudly for her mother. As soon as he approached her, he stopped abruptly and looked at her with a serious expression for several minutes. Then he turned in the opposite direction and told the manager that he would not have done anything, and a second later added that he would have simply ignored her. After the situation on the square, the men went to the gate where the Adventurers Guild is located because their next mission is to take place there. As soon as they entered the room, the boss began to look around carefully, and he emphasized to himself that everything here had changed a lot. Suddenly, these thoughts were interrupted by a subordinate who turned to the manager and told him that the line they would have to stand in was very long. The player was angry that he said that, so he asked him to shut up and just silently go and take their place in the line. Caesar quietly went to get in line without any objections, and the boss concluded that he seemed to know how to handle his assistant. The people who saw the young man ordering the big man to go and fulfill his request were shocked and began to discuss the situation among themselves. While standing in line, the subordinate began to smile suspiciously, as if he had heard what the people around him were talking about and was amused by it. After standing in line for several hours, they finally approached the counter where a young lady was sitting and told them that the registration fee was 1 gold coin. After payment, the girl gave them 2 adventurer badges that they can use in the City of Mazes. The gamer picked up their badge and asked a question to find out exactly how to use it because they didn't know. The lady began to explain that first, you need to drop a little blood, and then the system will display all the information about their characteristics. After a short pause, the girl added that according to this information, the system would suggest the optimal class for the maze. Caesar was very pleased with this, so he smilingly addressed all those present, saying that now they would see the full power of his boss. Then he turned away in the opposite direction and continued to smile broadly, saying to himself that these people had never seen anything like this before. The gamer angrily asked his subordinate to keep quiet because he didn't want to spend even a drop of blood to get any information. Because of these words, everyone immediately paid attention to them, and it took the boss a few minutes to calm down and realize that he was still interested. Cautiously, he looked around and saw that there was a heavy silence in the air, as if to symbolize that everyone present was a little afraid of them. And this may be because one of them has 4 advanced features that ordinary people simply cannot afford. But since he has charisma, the young man still decided to pierce his right index finger to get a drop of blood. After that, he began to smile ominously, and then said to himself that he was afraid to see his true potential. Literally in a second, he dropped a drop on the pass and turned to face the guild worker, saying that everyone would find out everything now. It took the girl a few seconds to understand the newcomer's intentions because she had never seen such reactions on her shift before and did not know how to react. As soon as she entered something into the computer, the system gave a message that the player could choose the class of swindler, thief, or crook. When the young man read all the classes available to him, he was shocked, to put it mildly, and so he stood open-mouthed in his seat. Even Caesar didn't know what to say at first, because he had praised his leader so much, and it turned out to be something completely different from what they expected. Your newbies stood in one place for several minutes and carefully reread what was written on the system screen several times. This angered the boss's subordinate, but he didn't say anything yet, but his partner could tell by his expression that things were really bad. After all, such classes can undermine his authority, and this can create a lot of problems for them in the future in passing the maze. Then the player began to think and analyze what they had been doing all this time, because these classes could be the consequences of what they had been doing. And the first thing he remembered was that he had threatened ordinary people, or rather a girl, and then he took the life of the criminal. The gamer realized that Caesar did not do it, but it all happened because he allowed the trouble to come from where no one expected. Suddenly, the assistant changed his face and began to smile mysteriously, and then said to himself that it was really his boss. However, what happened next surprised the boy, and he could not understand why the system changed the classes to completely different ones than he had heard before in a few minutes. To find out, he approached a member of the Adventurers Guild and quietly asked her what was going on and why his classes had changed. The girl calmly explained that in order to get an accurate result, the system needs to analyze the owner more deeply, so the classes can change. Having received an exhaustive answer, the young man began to carefully study the offer, which included the possibility of becoming a boss, organizer of a disappearance, or a mercenary. At that moment, Caesar came up behind him and said that a subordinate should answer to his superior, so he would make a great contribution to this case. These words only irritated the guy, so he ordered him to shut his mouth in a stern tone, even without looking at his partner. And after he had said that, he chose a class called Chef for himself, and his subordinate began to smile and be sincerely happy. Then the system reported that the player can effectively use his abilities, and this can be a great feat for an adventurer. As they were heading for the exit, the teacher turned to Caesar and asked what class he was in, and the gentleman quickly replied that it was called Marauder. The young man stopped for a second and said that this class was very suitable for an assistant, and the thought flashed through my mind that he had no doubt about it. The subordinate thanked him for such words, but the boss did not say anything, just thought it was not a compliment. After registering, the men went to the waiting room, where several men were already waiting for their assignment, sitting at a distance from each other. Suddenly, Caesar approached them, sitting with his arms folded across his chest, and asked them, smiling broadly, if they thought they were lucky. One of the men present said something that everyone was shocked to hear, and did not expect to hear at all, and all because he began to thank his subordinate. Even the gamer himself froze in his seat with his mouth wide open because he sincerely did not understand why his partner could be so grateful. The gentleman in the black cloak went on to say that he would pardon and release those who had good reasons to get out of this place. The boss decided to intervene, so he gritted his teeth and angrily turned to the assistant and reminded him that he had been told earlier to respect others. The interlocutor calmed down a bit and turned his gaze to the manager, apologized, and repeated the word respect, which he did not like very much. After that, he turned his head to all those present and said that he would keep his promise and allow everyone to leave the place unharmed. The player again froze in place with his eyes wide open because this was clearly not what he wanted to hear from his subordinate. The guy could not understand what was wrong with his partner, because if they did something here, the best adventurers would come after them. The boss began to think that such behavior could be caused by the Marauder class, where with each life taken, the participant only becomes stronger. Looking at Caesar, the young man mentally addressed him and said that such behavior was too much and that it should be stopped immediately. However, he suddenly stopped this monologue because he realized that his subordinate had decided to start the retaliation right then and there. And the fact that he promised to let everyone go unharmed was a pure lie, and it was readable on the face of the gentleman in the black cloak. Suddenly, one of the guys stood up and showed the bag and said that he had completely forgotten to put the money in the right account. With a serious expression on his face, the subordinate asked how much money was there, and the young man replied that there was 1 silver coin and 30 bronze coins. Caesar listened attentively and then asked a clarifying question about whether the young man really thought that this one-time deposit would save his other funds. Then the assistant smiled slyly and offered to leave it all to him, these words notwithstanding how much his supervisor, who was sitting next to him, was alarmed. After all, he realized that his partner now wanted to rob these guys, not just teach them a lesson. The blonde young man who offered the money hugged his bag and began to move toward the exit, saying that he did not want to give up his savings. However, he did not manage to escape because Caesar stabbed him in the back with a small knife, saying that he was not going to run after him and beg for something. After a short pause, the gentleman in the black cloak added that he would pardon the young man as promised, and the chief was shocked to see what mercy looked like on the part of the assistant. As it turned out, the knife hit the right shoulder instead of the back, and the victim fell to the floor and began to moan loudly in pain. All the other people in the line were very frightened and began to worry for their lives, some even closing their eyes to see nothing around them. At that moment, the boss realized that it was too late to let anyone out of that room unharmed. After all, there are a lot of guards outside the door who can be told everything in detail, and then everyone will know about Caesar's crimes. And because of this, they may not be allowed to join the Adventurers Guild, and the player concludes that the further they go, the more problems they will have. And looking at the floor, the young man realized that at the moment, they had no other option but to simply intimidate everyone present. However, this must be done in such a way that these people are very afraid for their lives and therefore do not say anything unnecessary, even to their closest friends. So the guy decided to use his special ability, charisma, and immediately after that he changed in face and his subordinate noticed it. This made Caesar very angry, so he quickly jumped to his feet and called everyone present idiots and said that his boss was bored. Then he turned the sharp end of his sword on them and said in a serious tone that he would give them a chance to cheer up his boss. After a short pause, the man added that if they failed to do this, he would simply kill them in this place. All the people who were sitting in the room waiting for their turn could not even imagine that such a strange day would be waiting for them today. Some of the men began to break out in a cold sweat because they were very frightened by such threats, while others began to look at each other. Two blonde and blonde boys sitting next to each other began to find out what their names were and how they could join forces. However, the blonde man took the conversation in a completely different direction and said seriously that he knew what Nostradamus had said before he died. Other members of the Adventurers Guild heard this conversation, so they stood there with their mouths open, waiting for the end of the conversation. Even the boss and Caesar himself noticed this and decided not to interfere with the blonde boys' thought because they were also curious. The guy who started it all changed dramatically in his face, and with his eyebrows raised, he loudly said a phrase that finished his sentence, but did not amuse the audience. After that, the room fell silent because no one knew how to react to this joke, because they didn't think it was funny at all. The angry Caesar gritted his teeth and called the young man an idiot, and then asked him if he really thought that such a flat joke would make the boss laugh. The guy was upset and covered his ears and began to shout loudly that he did not know anything better, and the assistant told him that he had lost his chance. The subordinate sharply raised his sword in order to deal with the guy who had made a rather unfortunate joke and did not make his superior laugh. But what happened next made the gentleman in black stop because the player seemed to be holding back and started laughing in order to attract attention. Then, rubbing his face, he began to think about what he didn't want to admit, but it was really very funny for a blonde. The subordinate turned his face to his supervisor and began to carefully study his facial expressions to find out if everything was really as he saw it. When he looked at him so closely, the boss wondered what was wrong with his partner because he looked rather mysterious after his laugh. So he quickly closed his mouth and sadly concluded that he could not even laugh and did not know how to live in such a sad world. In a second, he changed his face and said that it wasn't funny at all, and then added that if he hadn't laughed, the assistant would have killed them. Immediately after he said this, the young man began to clap his hands and laugh out loud so that Caesar would believe that he was very amused. This laughter lasted for several minutes and was so loud that the guild members present had to cover their ears because it was impossible to sit through it. The only one who liked it was a subordinate who said out loud that he had never heard his boss laugh so much and emphasized that the jokes were top-notch. When silence finally reigned in the room, Caesar was the first to break it, saying that when life is at stake, you can do anything to save it. For some reason, the words did not calm all those present. On the contrary, they began to break out in a cold sweat from the fear the assistant inspired in them. The boss himself did not yet fully understand where his partner was going, so he listened attentively to the following words about earning everything honestly. Then the gentleman in the black cloak again poked the audience with a sharp end and said that people who are not capable of anything will not leave this room alive. And finally, he added that the game had just begun, and it turned out that the waiting room of the Adventurers Guild turned into a prison cell. The gamer was very upset that he did not manage to settle everything, and the thought ran through his mind that he felt very sorry for everyone present. At this time, Lena was walking in the suburb of Brahm, and she was very cold because it was very cold, and she was also interested in how her boss and his subordinate were feeling. Suddenly, she stopped and looked up at the sky and smiled broadly that these two could be doing something very interesting and maybe even useful. At that moment, in the waiting room, each of those present tried to make the manager laugh, and one of them tried to do it with knives. At first, the newcomers were not amused by the usual circling of knives in the air, and so they sat with serious expressions almost throughout the performance. And somehow, at one point, the guy who was performing failed to catch one knife, and all the others began to fall on him, causing him sharp pain. And it was the way he was trying to dodge his weapon, and the way he was screaming in pain, that made the chief and the assistant laugh, and so they couldn't stop. The girl who was looking for her future partners closed her eyes in the middle of the street and blushed a little, immersed in the memories of their first meeting. She remembered the eyes of her boss, in whose gaze she noticed that he was not afraid of any danger, but she wondered what was behind them. Then she fully imagined the boss, and assumed that he was endowed with so much charisma that it was simply impossible to reach him. Then she remembered Caesar's words, that the leader wanted to create a dark organization that would destroy the whole world, and this alarmed her a little. In a second, she imagined the three of them being in this dark organization that was not controlled by the guild of criminals and would destroy the world. At this time, something strange was happening in the waiting room again for the newcomers, but they gave everyone a chance to show their best. One young lady, whose turn it was to make the boss laugh, sat down and began to cry loudly because she needed to earn money to treat her mother. After a few minutes of watching the sobbing, the player turned to the girl and said that it was very boring and let her come up with a better lie. When Lena opened her eyes, she clenched her hands into fists with joy and shouted loudly that the boss would definitely succeed in his plan. In a second, she was already raising her arms in the air and at the same time jumping with the pleasure of being part of this dark plan. Then she remembered that she had failed even the first task of her new boss and had simply run away from the guild. Mentally, she apologized to her boss and then emphasized that even he would have a hard time if he was pursued by a guild of criminals. Immediately after that, the girl jumped up high and said to herself, smiling broadly, "I can't do without her help here." Meanwhile, in the maze city, Caesar and his partner went outside, and the first thing they did was stop and look around. The subordinate looked in front of him and asked if the boss had anything to say to him, and the boss said that it was very cold. After hearing this answer, the assistant replied that it was great because a warrior should not be afraid of even the most severe cold, wind, and frost. Hugging himself even harder, the gamer realized that since his partner said so, he could not tell him that he was actually cold. Suddenly, the gentleman in the black cloak turned his head to the boss and said that he was just incredible, and the guy wondered why he thought so. Caesar began to explain, looking the young man up and down, saying that his clothes were so tattered and he looked as if he didn't need the cold. When the subordinate turned his head forward, the supervisor hugged himself again, and the thought flashed through his mind that his partner could give him a coat. The young man did not leave the thought of the cloak so easily because he walked behind and examined all the weapons that were bought with his money but worn by his assistant. As soon as they walked through one block, the guy remembered that he hadn't seen Lena for a long time and wondered what she might be doing now. However, he could not think of anything else but the cold wind that pierced all parts of his body, and out of anger, he kicked the trash can. This object began to spin around, and then its lid opened, and a girl with long red hair fell out of the middle, holding her head. When the men realized that Lena had appeared in front of them, they stood next to her and asked her questions to find out what she had forgotten in the trash can. The young lady continued to hold her head, and at the same time, cautiously raised her head at her comrades and said out loud that she was dead. Because of this, she pretended to be very tired and said that she had been looking for them for a very long time and the wind was too cold outside, so she decided to hide. The boss listened carefully and then clarified that she was not serious because she could have waited for them in the guild. Lena was a little upset and angry that she was waiting for them in the trash, and they were in a warm guild all this time. The player folded his arms across his chest and said in a serious tone that they were sitting in a comfortable waiting room and had a pretty good time. Then the young lady sadly looked forward and said that some members of the criminal guild were also members of the adventurers guild. A second later, she added that if the men had met them, they would have made a big noise that would have attracted a large number of people. After these words, Caesar wanted to say something to his boss, but he did not let him say anything because he had a question himself. And after a short pause, the young man looked into Lena's eyes and asked her a question to find out if they had managed to cover their tracks. The lady made a strange grimace on her face, smiled nervously, and replied that she had said she was done and that she had screwed up the assignment. At these words, the boss was simply beside himself with anger, but at first, he tried to keep it in check as best he could. However, he could not contain his rage, so he loudly shouted to his assistant to put the garbage back where it belonged, and the latter immediately agreed to comply. When the girl saw her subordinate approaching her, she began to say that her whole body was frozen, and that is why she could hardly move. However, this did not stop the gentleman in the black cloak, and he still shoved the young lady back into the trash can and put a large stone on top. After that, the men turned in the opposite direction, and walking there, the player said that he felt much better than before. Then the gamer had a thought that he was becoming more and more like Caesar, who was known for his cruel actions. A few hours later, the men were caught up by Lena, who began to explain on the move that as soon as they left, she had gathered everything of value. Then the interlocutor said that she hid all her valuables in a space bag in the office of the head. The boss stopped to listen to the lady's story about how she wanted to make the mercenary guild look guilty, but to do so, she needed to work with the body. However, as soon as she began to do so, the manager returned to the room and caught her doing this shameful thing. The player began to clarify that she did not have time to get rid of the evidence and was caught by her supervisor, and the girl confirmed all this. Then the boss plunged into his thoughts, because everything the interlocutor said made him conclude that she had taken on Caesar's guilt. However, even after that, he decided to get rid of her because she was useless, because she didn't do a good job even with the first task. At these words, the girl stopped in her tracks and began to cry because the decision was not fair because she was caught when she was doing dirty work. Hearing the sobbing, the manager turned to the girl, and the thought flashed through his mind that he was powerless when someone was crying. Then he came up to her and put his hand on her head and said that she was good for getting out unharmed, but she could have taken the space bag. Lena started talking nonsense again, and two versions of what happened when they left the scene of the fight have already been formed. This made the manager think that it looked like she herself was confused in her story, so she did not explain further. The two men began to move in the direction they needed to, but finally the gamer told the girl to wash and go to bed. All three of them came to a tavern where they intended to pay money to rent 2 rooms, one of which was to have a bathroom for a lady. The tavern employee said that it was quite late, and they had almost all the rooms occupied, so he could offer 2 single rooms. The partner was happy that the boss was taking such good care of her, but the guy said that he just wanted her to wash because she stank. When they were climbing the stairs, the manager began to think that there were only 2 rooms, and that Lena, since she was a girl, needed to be reinforced separately. But then he began to think that he couldn't leave Caesar without a room either, because he might lose his loyalty, and that's why the boss didn't know what to do. At first, the manager mentally decided to sleep in the room with Caesar, but then he remembered that he could destroy a person with a single handshake. Then the young man suggested that the assistant could just accidentally push him, and that would kill him, and then the game would be over. As soon as Lena was about to close the door to her room, the player realized that he should never spend the night with his assistant. So he stopped and turned to Caesar and told him to stay here, and he would find another room. The man in the black cloak stopped and was silent for a few minutes, thinking about something, and then slowly turned his head back. And as soon as he made eye contact with the boss, he asked if he really wanted to kill the tavern owner, and then clarified whether the sound would disturb his sleep. The guy closed his eyes and replied in a serious tone that his subordinate was completely right because his precious sleep was simply not worth it. Turning his back on his interlocutor, Caesar said that it was quite strange that the most cruel boss in the world gave him a room and refused to take revenge. Suddenly, he stopped on the spot and, smiling mysteriously, asked the supervisor a question to find out if he really cared about this criminal Lena. The young man blushed a little at these words, and so, looking away, he replied that he did not understand what the other man meant. The subordinate decided to clarify a little that she was just a loser who couldn't cope with the first task and was given a room with a bathroom. After a short pause, the gentleman in the black cloak added that they both knew she was an insatiable evil, and that's why the boss wanted to strangle her in her sleep without witnesses. The gamer just couldn't believe his ears, so he turned to the exit and said that he would rent a room in a better tavern than this one. Stopping at the very exit, the manager turned his head slightly to the assistant and told him to be patient, because he would see the benefits of Lena later. Caesar, of course, did not understand what his leader was getting at, but it seemed to amuse him, so he stood there and smiled broadly. The next morning, it became clear that the boss had spent the night in a luxury hotel and had a romantic dream in which he asked the lady to stay with him. However, when he opened his eyes, he did not see the person he wanted to see, so you could see the surprise in his eyes. It turns out that Caesar came into his room and pulled off the covers to wake him up to start his day. The guy slowly got up and sat down in the center of the bed and began to rub his eyes, while asking what his assistant was doing here at such an early hour. Then the boss began to think that the sun had just risen, and this one was already up and about, and he couldn't even get up properly for more than 3 hours. However, what the manager saw next made him wake up abruptly and quickly, think about what could have happened during the time he had been napping in the room. It turns out that his subordinate began to wipe his large sword with a blanket because it was completely covered in bright red blood. The chief, sitting on the bed with his eyes wide open, slowly asked questions to find out what it was and whether his partner had killed anyone. Smiling broadly, Caesar happily announced that he had killed 7 people overnight and that there were no witnesses to this crime. Looking at the blood on the bedspread, the player looked down and wondered if his assistant could really do this to so many people. Then I remembered a subordinate saying bad things about Lena and assuming that the boss wanted to take her life in her sleep. After that, the young man opened his frightened eyes and looked at his partner, wondering if this maniac could really do away with the young lady. Suddenly, the door on the ceiling began to move, and a second later, a red-haired lady appeared and asked the manager how he slept. There was a pause in the room for a few seconds, and then the boss looked up and asked the girl a question to find out how she got there. Lena quickly replied that the boss would soon become an important person, and explained that she was worried about his life, so she decided to watch him at night. Lena and Caesar clapped their hands together, saying the same words, as if they had spent the night doing the same thing. Watching this, the manager emphasized for himself that from the outside, it looked very strong, but some things in the room caught his attention. Namely, there were many different traces of broken dishes on the floor and a pool of blood right in front of his bed, which alerted the young man. The only thing he clearly understood was that they had to get out of this room as soon as possible so that no one would find them here in such a mess. At this time, in the Adventurers Guild, a group of people had just returned from one of the mazes, some of them so exhausted that they could not walk on their own. The girl, who was surprisingly well behaved, said that in the previous mazes it was easier, but here she could not read the monster's attacks in time. Her partner began to recall the hike and emphasized that despite this, they managed to organize a full-fledged raid on small groups of mobs. Another member of the first group turned to his comrades and asked if they thought the initial dungeon was too hard. Suddenly, one of the guys' attention was drawn to Caesar because he was not typically dressed, and he could not believe that this person was a newcomer. The subordinate was furious, and gritting his teeth, he angrily asked the young man why he was looking at him like that, and a second later, added that he was looking at the boss. Lena waded into this conversation, smiling broadly, saying that this man was looking at her and then asked the supervisor to order him to be killed. Without even turning his head to the assistant, the player was able to convey his order to him, and Caesar slowly began to take his sword out of the special sheath. However, he didn't get it all the way through because this time, he decided to use energy that damages opponents from a distance, so they flew apart. Lena was very happy to see all this, and the system gave a message to the gamer that the notoriety of his subordinate had increased by 1%. After that, the boss turned to his partners and said that it was time to stop wasting time because today they had to take measures for further action. Caesar reacted quite calmly, but the girl began to jump up and down with joy because they were finally going to do something. The leader decided to ground the young lady a bit and said that first, they would go to the maze and start with the tasks for beginners. There was a short pause between the comrades, which was broken by a subordinate who asked why they should get involved with some nonsense. The boss explained that they needed records of the tasks performed so that later they wouldn't have to demonstrate their strength and threaten everyone on every corner. Finally, the man added that they would be able to count these tasks toward a proof medal. Caesar began to smile broadly at this. But Lena was not satisfied with this, so rubbing her chin, she asked a question to find out why the task was for beginners. The assistant came up behind her and called her a stupid girl, saying that this was to finally break those who find them difficult. Watching their conversation, the manager concluded that the two were getting along well, and that this could only have happened after training together. Then the player realized that he had a great team, because Caesar has 20% power, and Lena has a spatial pouch that is always with her. The next thing the manager did was to choose a task for them in the system, and he really liked one because it gave him a lot of experience. And then he will be able to raise his level without any obstacles. This made the young man smile with satisfaction, because it was just the perfect plan. After this discussion, the boss turned to his partners and said that since the task was clear, they could start working on it right away. In a matter of minutes, the three found themselves in a maze, and the system immediately warned them that if they went to the center, they would run into a wall. In this wall, there is a door that is the entrance to the labyrinth, and this giant structure was built to prevent monsters from escaping. As soon as the leader and his assistants entered the maze, they were immediately met with the bodies of the dead. Caesar said that something could have destroyed them. Stopping in his tracks, the gentleman in the black cloak began to fantasize that a giant or a minotaur, or perhaps even a troll might be roaming around. This fantasy was stopped by a gamer who emphasized that if there really were such monsters, the guild would stop letting newcomers in. The subordinate smiled sadly and said it was too bad because he had a small hope of showing what he was really capable of in battle. Suddenly, Lena pointed her index finger in the opposite direction and said that goblins were sitting there and robbing people who had died during the mission. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other, and then the boss said that it looked like they were the first rivals and that their colleagues should deal with them. Caesar's eyes simply lit up with joy, and he began to slowly reach for his sword, which was behind his back, and said something terrible to the monsters. While this eloquent speaker was trying to scare the opponents, the young lady took out two knights with quick and sharp movements and threw them at the green creature, and they hit the creatures directly in the chest, which killed them, and the lady turned to Caesar and asked why he was playing out this theater. The gentleman in the black cloak was seriously angry because of what the lady had done, so he called her a woman and told her not to steal his loot. Then he raised his sword and looked her right in the eye and said that it was time to show her where she belonged, and this did not scare the young lady. But the manager was shocked that at the very beginning, a dispute arose between the two, and that they would fight each other at the end. As soon as the two stood up to start their fight, green goblins ran at them from different directions. The first to notice this, of course, was the manager, because he not only watched his teammates fight, but also analyzed everything around him. Then he remembered how one group of adventurers talked about the difficulty of this labyrinth, and his assistants fought among themselves. Suddenly, in this duel, Lena smiled broadly and took out several small knives and began to look closely into her opponent's eyes. And a second later, these knives flew at Caesar one after another, but did not hit him, but flew past, and for some reason, he was also smiling, not angry. This weapon hit the green goblins, who fell to the ground without signs of life, but there were also those who continued to run right at them. The manager watched what was happening in the labyrinth from behind a large stone, as he had no intention of participating. The only thing that scared him was that his assistants were now fighting with each other instead of going through the tasks for beginners. However, there was also something that made me think, because during this fight, messages popped up about monsters dying one by one. It was only after the system reported that their group had gained 78% experience that the boss began to believe in victory. When it was all over, the guy realized that the difference between him and other players was that he could use his assistants and not worry at all. As soon as they started to move on to the next task, the supervisor stopped and looked at Lena and said that she had done a good job with the order. The young lady was very amused by these words and pointed a finger at Caesar and emphasized that the boss had complimented her and had not said anything to him. The gamer decided to clarify a bit and said that he wanted to praise her at least once, but the lady should learn to work in a team. Lena said that she would try to do this in the future, and turned to her partner and said that he would deal with the next monsters himself. The subordinate listened attentively and said with a serious expression that if she broke her promise, he would take her life. The fight between the two started again, and the boss folded his arms across his chest and said that they were wasting their time. No one paid any attention to him, so the young man closed his eyes and added that if they continued in this spirit, they would not be able to move forward. Finally, he said that he wouldn't be able to hunt that way himself, and immediately Lena turned her head to the manager and happily clarified whether it was really true. Then he told the girl that he was the boss and could take the initiative, because after all, he also had to prove himself somehow during this task. After that, Caesar came up to him and asked him questions to clarify whether he was really ready for it or not. The player replied that he didn't see anything wrong with that, because Wilhelm Meyer's synchronization level was 40%. The subordinate did not like it very much, so he turned his head to the side but still agreed to his boss's decision. The only one who was happy was Lena, who raised her hand high and said with a big smile that she would finally see her boss in action. After a short pause, the girl added that she was sure that the manager was very strong and that he might have been a past master in the past. Suddenly, their attention was drawn to an old goblin who had just appeared, and then the lady pointed at him and said that now was the moment. And two subordinates began to send their boss into a fight, and the guy could not understand at what point everything turned against him. As soon as he made a few steps towards the opponent, he started thinking about how well he needed to fight to show a high level. However, when he pulled out his destructive sword, he realized that it was all nonsense, because the only thing that mattered was how he looked in the eyes of his partners. He decided that a simple fight with the sword would be enough, and so in a second, he tried to point it at his opponent. But then something happened that he hadn't expected. The old goblin quickly ran up to his opponent and hit him on the head with his stick. After that, the guy realized that the old man was quite fast and decided to use his weapon better. During the next blow, the creature was able to dodge and even jump back a few meters, and the player was a little tired of waving his weapon. The only question that interested the leader was whether he had taken the life of this monster, and to do so, he turned his head back to see it with his own eyes. However, the goblin not only did not die, but stood there unharmed, and then he abruptly turned in the opposite direction and began to run away. The gamer began to order him to stop and come back, because he wanted to deal with him once and for all, not stay like this. However, the monster had no intention of stopping, and the young man decided to run his sword in its wake, as he was sure that it would stop the creature. But he flew only a few meters and fell to the ground, after which the boss began to break out in a cold sweat from the excitement of how he looked in the eyes of his subordinates. The only thing left for the guy to do was to go and pick up his weapon and return to his two partners with his head bowed. As soon as he approached, Caesar said that, to be honest, the leader fought quite well given his body structure. Suddenly, Lena intervened in this conversation to clarify that her subordinate had said that it was a better battle than he expected. It was immediately obvious from the boss's expression that he was very upset because he was unable to fully understand his opponent. So he turned around in the opposite direction and with his head down, turned to his assistants and told them to stop this discussion. After that, there was an awkward pause between everyone present, and everyone watched the manager walk away. But Lena decided to ask if he was sick. However, the young man did not answer, but continued to walk with his head bowed, pretending that he had not heard anything. This reaction made the young lady very angry, and she demonstrated this by loudly shouting after the boss that this was not the way to do things. In a few hours, they managed to reach the upper floors of the maze, at which point it was decided to light a fire. Since the unpleasant incident, no one has dared to speak up, but the girl has been looking at her friends strangely. Suddenly, she raised her right hand up and happily said that her name was Lena, and she was only 16 years old, and therefore needed a good night's sleep. Caesar was really angry about this, so he said that the lady was silent, and then clarified that she really wanted their sick boss to stay up all night. The girl asked him not to call her a girl and asked how old he was, and a player intervened and told him not to worry about him. After that, the young man turned to Lin and told him that Caesar was only 15 years old, and that they would both be on guard that night. The young lady just couldn't stop her hysterical laughter because she couldn't believe that the manager's subordinate was smaller than her. Then the assistant decided to express his opinion and said that he did not care about the age of those who were younger than him, which made the interlocutor laugh a lot. The gamer was already tired of these arguments, so he menacingly told the two to shut up and not waste their energy because they would have to spend the night here. A second later, the guy turned his head to Lena and accused her of getting them lost in the maze because it is impossible for a criminal to be unable to find the way out. He went on to emphasize that people like her should be the best subclass of bandits, and the first thing she should have done was to improve her orientation. Lena smiled broadly and said that the gentleman was right, but a second later she added that she hadn't even learned anything like that, and didn't even know what was needed. The player froze in surprise on the spot, and then asked what the lady was studying, and she replied that she was developing stealthy penetration and the art of the criminal. The young man decided to clarify the basics of hacking orientation or enchantment. Lena answered with satisfaction that she had not studied this either. Caesar decided to say that, despite the girl, he was trying to get them to the surface in the best way possible at the time. However, when the boss remembered that moment, he realized that part of the exit was blocked only because the subordinate was swinging his sword in different directions. Lena emphasized that her partner had also failed, so she asked him to call her big sister since she was older. The gamer shouted loudly for the two to shut up and said that he had taken food for 2 days just in case, so he would be able to hold out. After a short pause, the young lady smiled broadly and said that their boss was just an incredible person and asked why he hadn't taken the card then. After these words, there was a pause among the group of people again, although everyone had a lot of thoughts, but no one dared to express them. The player was upset that he could not cope with his subordinates because they always had some contradiction to his words. Several hours had passed, and it was time for some to rest and for others to stand guard, and the leader himself had to do it. Of course, the guy was angry because he believes that he was forced to do it, but according to all the rules, he is the boss and should not be guarding his assistants. The guy hasn't slept properly for a few days, and because of this, his skill level may begin to decline, so he needs to get out of the maze immediately. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the white blanket under which Lena was supposed to be resting, but she was not there, and the manager wondered where she could have gone. Then I remembered how the young lady said that her growing body needed a good night's sleep, and she probably hid to avoid being on duty. These reflections were interrupted by a lady who appeared suddenly from the right side and frightened the manager, who was standing calmly and not touching anyone. Lena, smiling sincerely, emphasized that the boss protects them despite his illness and complimented him on his bravery. Then the girl recalled the moment when she got angry with the boss and said that she probably went a little overboard at that moment. Then Lena began to reach out to her boss's face, saying that she was so worried about him at the time. A second later, the young lady dodged and added that she was so ashamed that she decided to rectify the situation and teach him a skill. After these words, the system immediately displayed a message that the criminal Lena wanted to teach the boss a new skill. The gamer even liked this idea, but the only thing that worried him was that it required a high level of sympathy or loyalty. However, such a chance is very rare, especially when it comes to NPCs because they usually do not agree to share their skills for any money. Immediately after these thoughts, the guy asked the woman what skill she wanted to teach him right now. The young lady, smiling broadly and looking directly into the chief's eyes, asked him if he knew what skill was most necessary for a criminal. The young man did not hesitate to answer that it could be the art of destruction. Lena confirmed her supervisor's guess. Almost licking her dagger, the girl began to say that there was a very important trick to this art, and it consists in getting to the target quickly and hitting only vital points so that the victim dies quickly. Covering the chef's mouth with her hand, the lady added that speed and accuracy are important here, and the target should not even realize what has happened. The gamer was interested to hear this information, and the interlocutor continued to say that they would start training now. Then she asked the boy to look up, and pointing her dagger there, she used a force that released a blue laser. When a small hole appeared in the ceiling, the lady turned to the boss and said that he should do the same thing 1,000 times. For the first few minutes, the young man just stood there silently and looked at his assistant's weapon. And then he sadly replied that his sword could not withstand this, and the thought flashed through his mind that he did not even realize what had happened. Lena pushed the sword into the chief's hands and explained that there was no need to hit with all your might, just to improve the accuracy of the execution. Then she added that you need to keep a sufficient distance, and then the sword will not wear out quickly and will last for several years. Then the young man had to make a slight lunge and barely touch the wall with his sword, and the chief began to try to do everything the young lady advised him to do. However, he had an urgent question that he immediately asked, and it concerned what would happen if he did not calculate his strength at some point. The girl replied that then the victim's blood would be dripping in different directions, and it would be easy to recognize the perpetrator, so she had to run away immediately. The last phrases alarmed the boss a bit, and he even suggested that the girl might just be making fun of him. The only thing he learned from the training was that he shouldn't hit the wall, so the blow should be stopped before it reaches the desired point. And immediately, at that very second, he used a force that fired a blue laser right into the wall opposite the manager. However, for some reason, a bump was formed at the site of the impact, not a hole, and then the system issued a message that the training was over. Next, a new message popped up saying that the progress made was only 3% and that the manager had failed to learn a new skill. At that moment, a girl came up to the player and patted him on the back, laughing and saying that it seems that he has no skills to kill people. The gamer was very upset by this. He gritted his teeth, closed his eyes, and concluded that he had lost more than he had gained in the maze. Suddenly, Caesar was behind him, yawning and turning to his supervisor, who did not expect his subordinate to catch him. But he was so upset that he turned to his assistant and told him that if it was nothing serious, he could go back to sleep. The interlocutor turned in the opposite direction and said that there was a group of adventurers around the corner, and everyone turned their heads there. When the two guys noticed the three standing a few meters away and looking at them, they were a little alarmed. It's because the boss and his assistant's eyes glowed red, and Caesar looks very scary. The adventurers turned in 1 second in the direction they came from and began to run away quickly. The leader shouted after them where they were running. The gamers intend to learn from them the way to get out of this place, but the system gives a message about a new task to catch the adventurers. The guys who were fleeing at that time managed to talk to each other about the fact that these three men had destroyed all the passages in the maze so they could be dangerous. The leader realized that they were their only chance to get out of here, so he turned to Caesar and told him to catch the boys without blinking an eye. The subordinate listened attentively to the order and replied that the boss could count on him because he intended to do everything as best and as quickly as possible. As soon as he said this, the man pushed off the ground with one foot and began to move quickly in the direction where the adventurers were fleeing. The two partners remained in their seats and were shocked, to put it mildly, at how well Caesar was able to move. Lena went on to emphasize that the assistant uses force to push off the ground better and accelerate, but it can be done even faster. After that, the lady turned her gaze to the boss and asked him if he was worried, and he replied that he was almost 100% confident in Caesar. However, the girl decided to clarify whether the guy was worried about both of them, and these words made the boss wonder what the interlocutor meant. Lena decided to help with the thinking a bit, and said that Caesar was also very poorly oriented in space. The boss still couldn't understand what the young lady was getting at, so a second later she asked how Caesar would be able to find them if he ran far away. And only now the guy realized and began to worry that they really didn't know how far they could run, so they needed to catch up with everyone. So he turned to Lena and told her that she had to run after him immediately, because later she would have to perform a task to find her subordinate. Without waiting long, the two partners began to run, and at some point, the boss emphasized that they should run with all the strength they had. After 3 minutes of such intense running, the two were forced to stop for a rest, where the manager simply could not properly clean himself up. When Lena watched all this, she said that the boss really has some kind of illness that can cause his heart to stop from overwork. Rising to his feet, the young man replied that he would not die. These words, without any evidence, convinced the girl of this, so she did not go into details. Looking forward, the young lady folded her arms across her chest and said that then they could only hope that the subordinate would still be able to find them. Immediately after these words, the system issued a message that Caesar had managed to catch up with the fleeing adventurers. The manager was happy and said that when you need to work with your hands and not your head, there is no equal to your subordinate, so you don't have to worry. Lena decided to ground her interlocutor a bit, so she said that if they failed to find this psycho, it would be the end of them. Then the leader said that the adventurers should know the way well, so maybe they could tell Caesar where to go. The young lady just could not contain her emotions of joy, so she began to smile broadly, and the young man could not understand the reason for such joy. Turning slightly in the opposite direction, he addressed the lady by name and asked what she would do once they got out of here. Without waiting for any response, he said that her desire to teach him something inspired his respect, so he would like to buy her something. Immediately after hearing everything, the girl froze in place with her eyes wide open in surprise because she clearly did not expect such a proposal. As soon as she understood the meaning of all the words, the lady blushed a little and then sincerely said that her boss was simply the best. Overjoyed, Lena jumped up to the manager and looked him straight in the eye and said that she would like to have a delicious meal right after her dismissal. At first, the gentleman did not know how to react to this, because a high-level criminal of the criminal guild was just asking for food instead of something big. So he agreed to fulfill her wish as soon as they got out of the maze, and he felt sorry for the girl because of the way she lived. Then he tried to smile sweetly, and finally added that he would buy his interlocutor a whole bunch of delicious dishes that she wanted. After that, the young man said that Caesar needed some time to return and offered to do something useful for them. However, they were not able to start because the system gave a red message that the assistant had destroyed one adventurer. This news made the boss very angry and his eyes glowed red because there was a problem here too. Suddenly, these thoughts and anger were interrupted by Lena, who pointed forward with her index finger and said that there were more adventurers. This time, the group of players consisted of 3 members, including a blonde girl, a guy in a metal outfit, and a guy with a shield. As soon as these two saw who was approaching them, they got very excited and began to make a plan in their heads to take them hostage. However, the 3 of them were not going to give up so easily, so each of them took out his weapon, and then the gentleman in metal clothes turned to Lena and told her to run away. And a second later, he added that the man standing next to her was dangerous, and the girl was just shocked to hear such statements from someone new. After that, the adventurer turned to the manager and called him a bastard and asked how he dared to hold the girl hostage. Hearing such words in his direction, the player began to think about why they were addressing him like that and why they were talking about such nonsense. The only thing that worried the boss at the moment was that he was definitely not up to the task of sorting things out because his performance was declining due to lack of sleep. But if you do nothing, Caesar will come and kill everyone. Then the Adventurers Guild will announce a hunt for them and everyone will be looking for them. Then the guy decided to look for support from Lena, but when he turned his head to her, he noticed that she could hardly stop herself from laughing. However, she could not restrain herself, and laughing loudly, she said that she was really a poor girl who was taken hostage by this thug. Immediately after the words were spoken, an arrow flew near their heads, which scared the couple and made Lena think a little. As it turned out, this arrow was launched by an adventurous young lady who was still standing in a pose for a shot and addressed the leader and said to let the lady go. The assistant manager was very amused by the whole situation, and the three adventurers decided to attack the offender in order to save the girl. One of the boys launched his dagger, but it did not hit the target because Lena was able to push the player back a few meters in time. The gentleman in metal clothes was surprised to see someone dodging weapons like that, so he said he had never seen anyone dodge weapons like that before, so he had to be ready for anything. Suddenly, one of the adventurers said that they could not defeat this opponent because their luck had turned away from them as soon as they entered the maze. A second later, he added that he had once promised his comrades that he would fight with them to the last, so he would even lie down in pigtails, but would not abandon them. Then the man in metal clothes turned to the girl Carly and said that he had fallen in love with her at their first meeting. Hearing this confession, the lady was shocked. Then a blush appeared on her cheeks, and finally she told him to repeat it when they returned. The chief was a little alarmed by what was happening, and a strange thought flashed through his mind, that the three of them were acting as if they were filming a drama. As soon as the smile disappeared from Lena's face, she said that she had had enough fun and suggested that the manager destroy these adventurers. The player did not want to take someone's life, but he did not fully know what to do in this case. Then the system gave a red message that Caesar had also destroyed the second adventurer and that the leader would get some experience as a group member for this. Immediately after that, another notification appeared that a new level had begun, and a class skill called the Chef's Spirit was available to the player. The guy's face changed dramatically because he clearly liked this update and mentally said that it was exactly what he needed. When the young lady saw the expression on the head's face, she emphasized that it looked like he was killing 50 people every day. These words made the young man come to his senses because such figures alarmed him a bit, and he began to wonder if he really looked like that from the outside. Then he put his head down and said a little sadly to himself that he would like to look at his reflection in the mirror now. However, now the young man decided to test his new skill and looked at the attackers and told them to freeze in their fear. After that, he stood in one place and waited for the outcome. But the adventurers were getting closer and closer and had no intention of stopping. As soon as Lena realized that her boss's life was in danger, she turned to him and shouted at him why he was standing there like a stone and pushed him aside. Suddenly, a gentleman in metal clothing approached him, and drawing his sword, immediately pointed it at his opponent to deal him a crushing blow. But it flew a few meters away from the head of the manager and froze in the same position, and at that moment, the guy was covered in cold sweat from fear. However, when he came to a little bit of consciousness, he noticed that his attackers were standing in front of him, almost motionless, and looking forward with wide eyes. The first thing that came to the gamer's mind was that his new skill had worked, but there was something behind him that he hadn't seen yet. As it turned out, Caesar was already standing there and demonstrating the weapons he had, and then he even clarified that the attacker had a toy sword. At first, there was a pause between all the participants in the fight as everyone tried to develop a plan that would be beneficial to them. Suddenly, this silence was broken by a gentleman in metal clothes who opened his mouth wide and said to the opponents that they would never retreat. Immediately after the words were spoken, the so-called adventurers attacked the subordinate, and they did so simultaneously to distract attention. Lena intervened in the fight and sniffed her partner's clothes and said out loud that she could smell blood. A second later, she added that it didn't look like it belonged to Caesar, after which the lady turned her gaze to the boss and asked his opinion. The gentleman in the black cloak began to explain that those two bastards turned out to be the killers of the adventurers and were waiting for the groups to rob them. After a short pause, the subordinate added with a smile that he had taken care of everything and even brought their various weapons with him. The chief was interested in one question. Why did these murderers of the adventurers run away when they saw their group? Caesar replied that it was quite obvious because the leader had a look on his face as if he were taking the lives of 50 people every day. Then the gamer turned to the attackers and decided to ask them a question that he could not answer on his own, but maybe they could. As soon as he saw that all the attention was focused on him, he asked what they were thinking and looking at his expression. None of the three could dare to speak first, so after a few seconds of pause, the fallen man in the center said that he thought he was dead. For some reason, Caesar did not like the answer and called the adventurers ungrateful and asked if they really thought they were already safe. Then he shouted and asked if that was all they were thinking when they looked at his boss's face, because there was not a drop of sincerity in those words. Finally, he added that he saw no reason to leave them alive, so he would kill them all at once, but the leader managed to stop this impulse. And he turned to his attackers and said that the punishment for what they were trying to do would be to wash the weapons Caesar had brought. For some reason, Lena was not surprised by what was happening around her. She jumped for joy because her boss recognized that she looked quite scary. After a few hours, they managed to get closer to the exit of the maze, and the girl emphasized that the boss was just a good man for thinking of cleaning the weapons. The young man replied that there was no other way, because it was stolen, and therefore, he needed to make it look good to sell it at a higher price. Almost before leaving, the gamer stopped and turned his head to one of the adventurers and thanked him for helping him get out. The young man was certainly pleased to hear this, but decided to warn his companion about what might be waiting for them on the way out. And a second later, he said that the guards at the gate were even worse than any bandits, so they would search everyone on the way out and take 10% of the loot. As soon as the young man listened carefully, the thought flashed through his mind that this had never happened in the city labyrinth. Therefore, he decided to clarify what would happen if they did not want to give anything away. Caesar immediately suggested that everyone be killed and everything be taken away. The boss didn't like it, but Lena decided to express her opinion, and so she said that they could use her beauty. The manager told them both to shut up and then turned to the bandit and said that he would go first to see what would happen to him. As soon as the young man approached the guards, he asked to be let through without being searched because he had found the adventurer's killers and wanted to inform the authorities. At first, the guards thought about it, but then immediately let the young man through, telling him to go immediately and report everything he knew. All those present began to pass through the gate, and the system issued a message that they were leaving the maze. Caesar immediately sensed something wrong with this, so he said that they had been told earlier that the guards at the exit would have to give 10%, and here they passed without any problems. Then the gentleman suggested that the boy could have told about the adventurer's killers to appropriate their experience. The boss saw that his subordinate might snap, so he asked him to calm down and suggested that the captured people should be sold into slavery. The group of adventurers, hearing these statements, began to panic and attack one of their own for wanting to deceive someone even in such a situation. After that, the system displayed a message that Caesar had a new skill called Intimidation, which amused the man. The assistant and his supervisor began to laugh out loud in unison, and the system then reported that their notoriety had increased several times. Immediately afterwards, their group turned to their partners who helped them get out of the maze and said goodbye while still laughing. As soon as they headed for the exit, they received a notification that the task was completed and their team received a certain reward for it. When the group approached the reception, the lady sitting there happily thanked them for dealing with the adventurer's killers. Then she smiled broadly and said that she would not call the guards thieves, who only take 10% of the profits. The manager wanted to end the conversation because he realized that there was no point in it, but suddenly the girl said that the guild also takes the same percentage. Lena managed to say that there were some thieves here, and the boss leaned over to the reception and said that this simply could not be because he had never heard of such a thing. The lady kept smiling and asking if it was really such a big percentage, and without waiting for an answer, she said she had a good offer. A second later, she said in a more serious tone that she could become their confidant, which made the young man think for a few minutes. The young lady went on to say that her name was Errol and that she believed adventurers should help each other in any situation. Late in the evening, in one of the churches in the town, the Holy Father held a strange service based on the word "end of everything on earth." A few minutes later, the man raised both hands in the air and shouted that the end would rule all living things on this earth. Suddenly, a powerful explosion occurred behind him, forcing him to stop and slowly turn his head to see who had done it. As soon as the dust settled, Caesar entered the church, and you could see on his face that he was not happy and even irritated. To put it mildly, the gentleman was shocked because he froze in place in the same position and could not understand what this man wanted in the middle of the night. The boss's subordinates stopped and turned to the priest angrily, but did not say anything further and began to maintain an incomprehensible pause. Then the gentleman decided to ask himself what the guest needed from him and if he could help him in any way and tell him about it. Immediately after this question, a man in a black cloak opened his mouth and eyes wide and shouted loudly that his boss was very seriously ill. A few hours ago, a group of 3 people were in a luxury hotel to make a plan of action. As soon as they entered the hotel lobby, the boss told his assistants that they would stay in this nice place for the night. Lena, as always, exploded with joy and raised her hands in the air and began to say loudly that the manager was the best, but Caesar just calmly thanked her. Then the girl began to run around in a circle, saying that last time he left them in a tavern and that she did not understand where the miser had gone before. At these words, the man began to smile broadly, because he knows that they have finally earned enough money and he is not going to stop there. After all, he did make a deal with the young lady at the guild's reception desk, and in return for her cooperation, she decided to reduce his team's income in the reports. The guy started to rejoice because he thought the system was a great idea, but he didn't understand where it all came from, whether it was a new skill or charisma. While the boss was not listening, Lena took the opportunity to tell her partner that sometimes their boss turns into a real bastard. When he came to, the young man said that they came here not only to sleep, but also to eat and drink and have some rest. However, he immediately decided to warn them that before they started doing all this, he had a condition regarding his assistants. Closing his eyes, the boss calmly told them that while they were here, they had to behave properly. Caesar emphasized that these words could only be intended for Lena, but she did not intend to take it personally, so she responded in kind. This fight was already gaining momentum, and the hotel employee decided to intervene and stop it at the initial stage because they were already disturbing others. After calming down, the 3 moved to the luxury hotel restaurant where they sat at one of the tables and ordered a drink. After they clinked their glasses, the young lady happily said that she finally understood how it feels when adults do this. No one reacted to this statement because the boss was just taking another sip and thought that it had been a long time since he had drunk in a game. Putting the glass on the table, the young man emphasized that it was very tasty, and then he turned to his subordinates and asked how much they usually drink. Caesar calmly told the manager that they were both underage, and Lena added that they were not allowed to drink alcohol by law. The guy completely forgot that they did not look their real age, so the assistant poured cold water into the glasses. Then the boss decided to discuss the important issue that they would not be able to explore the maze if they could not navigate it. So after that, he suggested that Lena learn a skill for this, to which the lady sharply replied that she did not want to because it was too boring. After a short pause, the leader said that he had thought about what she would say, so he would probably look for a bandit to join the group or buy a card. Taking another sip, the player reasoned that no matter how much good he did to these two, they still wouldn't listen to him. For some reason, Caesar became very angry, and although he had initially restrained himself, he began to blush and grimace. But then he slammed his hands on the table and shouted that the chef had drunk a whole glass of beer since he was only allowed to drink one sip. The manager did not expect to receive such a reaction, so he did not know how to react to it and simply stared at his subordinate. And the assistant continued to say that the gentleman was forcing them to celebrate with them while their illness was getting worse every day. The boss immediately requested a health report from the system, and it showed that he was completely healthy, and then the guy did not understand why the assistant was so worried. Without waiting for any explanation from Caesar, the young man turned his gaze to Lena and mentally asked her to explain what was going on here. But I noticed that tears appeared in the girl's eyes, and she said through them that despite her pain, the manager decided to arrange a holiday for them. Then the young lady began to punch her partner in the shoulder and asked him not to stand like a pillar, and Caesar decided to bring the priest immediately. In just a second, the subordinate turned around and began to quickly head for the exit to fulfill his plan to save his boss. Somehow, the young man ended up in Lena's arms and tried to stop his partner because he didn't need any priest. A few hours later, the assistant returned with the man he was looking for. The man entered the room, greeted him, and said his name was Luveric. At that time, the girl put the manager to bed, and the young man sitting next to him on the floor got up a little and said hello back. Looking at the book brought by the guest, the boy reasoned that the maze of priests in the city could be counted on one hand because they were hiding. When the priest came closer to the chief, he said that his assistants had simply blown it out of proportion and apologized for disturbing him so late. After a short pause, the player added that he couldn't let the priest go empty-handed since he had come to help him. As he handed over the bag of gold coins, the young man still reflected that he had never heard of such an organization as the End Times Witnesses before. So, before the guest left his room, he decided to satisfy his curiosity and asked what the man preached in his church. The gray-haired gentleman raised his eyebrows angrily and replied in a serious tone that he was preaching the end of the world. This seriously frightened everyone present, and the leader began to break out in a cold sweat and reasoned that this man was clearly a member of some dark sect. The gamer decided to find out how this gentleman's treatment was going, so he asked him if he could cure him at all. The man took one hand to the side and said again in a serious tone that of course he would do it, and therefore cut off the infected part of his body. And after a short pause, the man's eyes lit up with a red light, and he added that you cannot run away from the end with the help of illness. Out loud, the chief replied that these words sounded suspicious, and the thought flashed through his mind that this priest simply wanted to take his life. The priest began to explain that something would have to be done anyway, because he was informed that the gentleman was on the verge of death. The manager replied that it was a misunderstanding because he had only had a glass of beer and therefore decided to refuse the guest's services. As soon as the man received the bag of coins, he began to loudly address the representative of the end and said that this was the first time he had been paid for his work. Then tears of joy appeared in the priest's eyes, and he said that he could not leave so easily, but he did not know how he could thank these people. And immediately after that, he began to read some strange prayer, which was not very popular with all those present, because the guest had a terrible timbre of voice. The player did not know what to do, so he opened his mouth wide, but did not shout, but only thought in his head that this gentleman allowed himself to do this. In a few seconds, the guest's expression changed dramatically. His eyes became like glass, and he opened his mouth wide and shouted that he was about to perform the end-of-life ritual. Then the guest opened the book he had brought with him and raised his right hand up and shouted that he, as a servant of the end, ordered the disease to disappear. Immediately after that, lightning appeared in the sky and a loud sound of thunder was heard, and the manager was frightened by what was happening in the room. Then the priest pointed his finger at the patient, and a red light began to glow from its end, and his expression became very scary. Again, lightning appeared in the sky, from which the boss closed his eyes and began to think fearfully that he did not want to die in this room at this level of the game. However, in a few minutes, the young man opened his eyes and looked at the priest and realized that nothing had really happened. Caesar was not pleased with this spell, so he came close to the guest and angrily said what he had done because nothing had changed. The priest kept his gaze fixed on one point and asked everyone present to look out the window in a serious but calm tone. The trio immediately rushed to the window to see what could have happened there, and as soon as they got there, they noticed one man lying on the ground. A few minutes later, The group turned to face the priest, and the chief decided to find out what the intention of the young man, who was now lying down, was. The guest asked everyone to move away from the window and jumped through it without even opening it, and the glass particles flew in different directions. As soon as he landed, all the people who had gathered near the body began to look cautiously at the man who had jumped out of the window and remained unharmed. When the priest approached the victim, he put 2 fingers to his neck and, without feeling a pulse, realized that the young man was already without signs of life. The manager, looking out the window, began to break out in a cold sweat from excitement, and the thought flashed through his mind that this gentleman was sick to his stomach. Suddenly, Caesar was behind him, and he turned to his boss and asked him to deal with the situation, but did not wait for permission. He jumped through the window and in a few seconds landed in the same place as the priest. Looking directly into the guest's eyes, the assistant emphasized that he was conjuring as well as shouting, but it definitely did not look like healing. Then the assistant put his big sword to the priest's back and asked questions to find out what his ritual actually did. The priest clenched one hand into a fist and smiled broadly, saying that his ritual reduces the life force until the disease dies. After a short pause, the subordinate emphasized that the man had made a lot of noise and that he could cause his boss a lot of problems. Then he added that even if the guest wanted to cure the chef, he still could not be cured of such a big disease by some kind of ritual. The gamer continued to watch everything through the windows, and when he heard these conversations about rituals, the young man thought that in this case, he could have died. The priest calmly turned his head to his interlocutor, and holding his book open, asked if the man had decided to threaten the clan. Caesar smiled broadly, and clarified that he never asks for anything, and then said that he would tear this incompetent gentleman to pieces. As soon as the player realized that these two decided to fight, he almost fell out of the window, as he was shocked because he didn't want such attention to them. The priest continued to speak to Caesar in a calm tone, asking him how he had allowed himself to threaten a gentleman who was performing a sacred duty. The assistant decided that it was time to end these conversations, and so he swung his sword at the opponent who had used the sacred power. The chef froze in his tracks, with wide open eyes, surprised that the guest was so strong and managed to block Caesar's punch. This also surprised the subordinate, because in his experience, he had never seen an opponent able to resist his blows. He was obviously not going to stop, so he continued to wave his weapon from side to side, but no successful strikes occurred. During the next blow, there was a powerful explosion, and when the dust settled in a few minutes, the assistant chief began to peer closely at the ground where the sword had fallen. The victim should have been standing at that spot, but he was not there, so the weapon hit the concrete, which cracked into small pieces. Then Caesar noticed that a rather strange shadow flew next to him, which had an additional red color in its coloring. And then, as it turned out, it was a displaced priest, who continued to look into his book and mutter something under his breath. At that moment, the man decided to use ultra-fast shadow daggers, which in a matter of seconds headed towards the subordinate who was standing with his back to them. However, somehow the gentleman in the black cloak managed to react in time and dodge the weapon that was moving to take his life. The supervisor froze with his mouth wide open as his subordinate managed to resist the skill by simply waving his black cape. As soon as the assistant came to his senses, he wasted no time in running at the enemy, holding his large and heavy sword. However, the priest gave a worthy rebuff to the attacker because he used magical powers that he drew from a book that was supposedly sacred to him. But at some point, something happened that made the player think that the priest was already running out of strength and seemed to be fighting with his last breath. However, everything turned out not to be as it seemed at first glance, because at the moment of alleged weakening, the man was preparing shadow daggers. Therefore, as soon as the guest saw the right moment to use his weapon, he did so, and everything turned out exactly as he thought it would. He pierced Caesar. When Lena saw this, she said in the manager's ear that she thought her partner was losing, and this worried the guy because then the game would be over for him. Out of desperation, the gamer stuck most of his body out the window and began to think quickly about what he could do to save the situation. And so I came to the conclusion that Caesar cannot resist magic now, and such opponents as the priest usually appear in the second half of the game. However, the boy could not even imagine that they would have to fight a representative of the evil forces who uses ancient magic. At this time, despite his injury, the subordinate continued to fight with the enemy, using all his remaining strength. Watching this battle, the boss stood there for a few minutes, thinking about nothing. But then he came to his senses and began to think about what to do. He then suggested that he would send Lena to help, but this would not change the situation because the priest has a barrier against physical attacks. The problem is that they have very little time left because one of the daggers is aimed at Caesar's very important vital organ. The guest continued to read the magic spell, and the player suggested that they needed to do something to disrupt the spell. So the guy opened his mouth wide and shouted loudly for everyone to run away because the guards were approaching them, because he couldn't think of anything else. Of course, these words caught the priest's attention, and he even turned his gaze to the person who said them and stopped reading for a few seconds. However, as soon as he realized that he was speaking to them, he began to act and tried to stab his opponent with his dagger, but he failed. Because of this, he was a little confused and lost his vigilance, which Caesar took advantage of and grabbed the priest with his big hand and began to pull him back. However, in a second, he threw the attacker to the ground and put both hands on his chest and pressed with all his might so that he began to cough. When the subordinate realized that the man was no longer breathing, he happily informed his supervisor that he had dealt with the upstart who wanted to harm him. All the locals who were present during this battle were shocked by the way it unfolded, and especially by the way it ended for one man. But it didn't end like that, because the police were approaching the square, and the leader had noticed them from afar and didn't know what to do. When they approached the assistant, they saw that public property had been destroyed and a holy father serving in the church had been attacked. Suddenly, one of the women started pointing at the hotel windows and told the policeman that the accomplices of the thug were there. A second later, she added that she was sure it was the black-haired boy who was behind it all, because Caesar addressed him as his boss. While her assistant was being tied up by the police, Lena was thinking about what she should do in this case, since she couldn't escape from such a thug. Then the gamer had the idea that the two of them could escape and continue the game, but he could not realize his plan. After all, they were caught and interrogated in the police station in a few hours, because they wanted to know if the boy really gave orders to Caesar. Not receiving any answers to his questions, the investigator emphasized that the so-called chief himself had not been involved in criminal activity. Again, the man said that everything was clear with the priest from the side of evil, but they were still interested in the corpse of a man who had been killed by lightning the day before. A minute later, the gentleman added that the man must have been injured during their fight, so in his opinion, this is enough to press charges against the guy. Only then did the manager dare to speak, and he said that he might not look like it, but in fact, he was terminally ill. And that's why his assistant went and brought the priest to him, but at the time, the assistant did not even suspect that this gentleman was a member of the Witnesses of the End. Then the chief put his head down and said the following. He asked the priest to leave immediately, but he did not comply and decided to treat him anyway. After a short pause, the young man added that the lightning was aimed at him. The police officers listened attentively to the whole story. Later, the chief among them said that they had a witness who claimed that it was they who asked the priest to take the life of the guy on the street. Looking intently into the suspect's eyes, the man assumed that perhaps they wanted to recruit the guest, but everything did not go according to plan, and therefore a fight broke out. Inside, the gamer was already unglued, because after these words, he realized that this was a rather logical solution, but in reality it was not so. In order to recover a little and understand what to do next, the guy closed his eyes because he already realized that the police were sure of their guilt. At that moment, he saw an image of Lena standing behind bars, crying bitterly, asking the boss about their demonic army. The young man concluded that if they did not find someone who would prove their innocence, they would have to postpone the game for a while. The manager continued to sit with his eyes closed and his head down, and by this expression, one could understand that he was upset by all this. The chief among the police officers smiled sarcastically to himself and looked at the suspect and realized that he had almost surrendered and accepted his guilt. That's why he decided to break the silence, because he wanted to say that he was going to invite a witness to this room to prove the guilt of this guy's group. As soon as the door opened, a girl with purple hair named Errol entered the room, and she works at the reception desk in the guild. The supervisor immediately recognized her because they had previously entered into an alliance with each other. The young lady smiled broadly and told the detainee that she was glad to see him. When the policeman heard the last phrase, he froze in his seat in surprise because he could not understand how it could be that these two knew each other. Errol turned her head to the employee and smiling sincerely apologized because in her opinion, there had been some misunderstanding on her part. Hammer was still sitting with his mouth wide open in the same position, hardly moving and occasionally blinking his eyes to make sure he didn't miss anything. The chief officer began to clarify that the lady had previously said that she had heard the priest's words, and the girl replied that they probably did not understand each other then. Then the lady turned her attention to the detainee and said that he and his men had helped to catch the adventurer's killers, and she had personally written a report about it. After that, Errol turned her gaze to the policeman and asked him if he really thought that such a person would hang around with witnesses to the end. When she did not receive an answer, she squinted her eyes and clarified that the gentleman really just wanted to accuse the person to increase the percentage of solving cases. The investigator became seriously angry because of this. He gritted his teeth, blushed sharply, and turned to face the girl, pounding his fist on the table. And the leader was smiling broadly with joy because he clearly understood that they were just lucky today, and that they would soon all be free. A few hours later, all charges were dropped against Wilhelm Meyer and his group, and they were released from the police station. Then the system told the boss that they would receive 50 gold coins to cover medical expenses, and the guy started laughing happily. The lady who rescued them congratulated them on their release and said that this was the first time she had encountered such a case during her entire tenure at the guild. A second later, she added that she was happy to help them. Wilhelm, looking into the eyes of the interlocutor, also thanked her for saving him and said that he would pay for it. At these words, Errol's eyes glowed purple, and she playfully said that the gentleman would definitely become a special member of their guild. Then the girl jumped up and said that it was her day off, so they would see each other later. Lena went up to the boss and asked if he had seen Errol's expression. Wilhelm stood there upset because he hadn't slept well and hadn't even been able to rest properly. A second later, the guy was already shouting at the top of his lungs that he was very tired, and the assistant who was standing next to him analyzed this behavior of the manager. So, coming up behind him, he turned to the boss and smiling sweetly said that it was time to take his health seriously. The angry and tired young man turned Caesar's head and looked at him, wondering what this thug could have already come up with for him. A few hours later, the trio found themselves in the Church of the Order of Healers, where Wilhelm was immediately placed on a hard bed and a damp cloth was placed over his eyes. When one of the guys started to use magic to cure the guest, he suddenly stopped because he was not succeeding and was surprised. My partner said that, in his opinion, it was also strange, because usually the severity of the disease is manifested by the expenditure of divine power. After a short pause, the priest suggested that perhaps a high-level spell was cast on the gentleman that could not be broken by a priest in training. The player gently lifted the rag and looked at his doctors with one eye, thinking that he could not even see anything. Then the boy began to recall how a few minutes ago, Caesar took him in his arms and quickly ran to this place without even stopping. At this time, the boss was angrily addressing his subordinate and telling him that he was not sick, and therefore asked him to just let him rest and get a good night's sleep. However, Caesar didn't even want to hear about it because he was sure that his boss was sick and needed to be cured at all costs. While the priests were using their power and magic to cure the guest, he lay there and thought that he had to pretend to be sick in front of them. After a few minutes of the procedure, the priest froze in surprise and then said out loud that this simply could not be. Caesar, of course, was seriously frightened by these words, and he turned to the priest and asked him what he meant by saying such words. When he did not receive a quick answer, the gentleman in the black cloak approached the church minister and demanded more explanations of his words. The young man who tried to cure the allegedly sick man was frightened by the tone of the interlocutor and replied that he was not sure yet and asked for a little more time. The subordinate was even more enraged by the request for additional time, so he grabbed the priest's shirt and reminded him that the manager had a high-level curse. Then the assistant opened his eyes wide with rage and said menacingly that he had no time for any excuses, so he asked to bring the best priest. Caesar then asked if the young man had heard about what had happened to their fellow witnesses at the end, and after a short pause, added that he would do the same to them. Suddenly, a gentleman intervened in this fight and entered the room and immediately began to find out whether it was the seriously ill man lying on the bed. When the subordinate turned his gaze to the man who had just entered and looked at him carefully, he asked him who he was and why he had come. However, the Reaper did not pay attention to the questions asked of him. He continued to walk to the boss, and when he saw him, he said that he looked really bad. The priest turned out to be a young lady with blonde hair, who immediately decided to use her strength and capabilities to treat Wilhelm. However, a few minutes later, she froze in place with her eyes wide open in amazement, as she could not believe that this was even possible. Therefore, when she returned to Caesar, she first told him that her name was Elaine, and she was a middle-level priest. The manager opened his right eye a little bit to not only hear but also see what this newcomer had to say about his health. And then the lady said in a second that the man's curse was so strong that even she could not see him or feel him in any way. And finally, she added that this was the most powerful curse that could be, and these words frightened the assistants, and Lena even began to shed tears. The young man realized that he simply did not have the strength to fight it anymore, so he cried himself to sleep, asking everyone present to finally believe him. When the priests saw this, they did not understand why this severe disease affects only the facial expression and realized that their lives would change. The gamer continued to make faces and shed tears, while angrily thinking that such a curse could not even exist. Lena, in despair, slapped Caesar on the shoulder and asked him to do at least something, to which he replied that he would have to call a higher priest. As Elaine was about to leave the room, Wilhelm approached her and asked if he could talk to her for a few minutes. When the girl stopped, she turned her head to the man who was not addressing her, and after a second, he added that he wanted to discuss his illness in private. The young lady naturally agreed, and so she led the interlocutor to her personal library, where she seated him in a chair opposite her. About to sit down in her chair, Elaine put her right hand on the table and asked in a serious tone what the patient wanted to talk to her about. The chief looked down and replied in a calm tone that, speaking of curses, he did not really want to disturb the high priest. The lady began to say that if they studied such a rare curse, it would eventually help their order, and they would cover all the costs. The guy sharply clarified what would happen if they did even worse, and so he decided to remind them of the reputation of his assistants. After saying this, he paused for a moment and then added that even the Brahma police could not stop them because they only listened to him. Then the young man said that if everything goes wrong and he dies, he will die, and immediately after that, he asked where his assistants will go first. After listening carefully, the girl turned her head and gazed to the side and began to cough loudly with her hand over her mouth. And then she quietly replied that the one who was entrusted with such a monumental task was so damaged that he almost did not look like a normal person. The manager realized that these words did not convince the priest at all, so he was disappointed and began to wonder why everyone was so picky about him. One of his thoughts was interrupted by the interlocutor, who loudly banged her hands on the table. asking if the gentleman already knew what was wrong with him. A second later, Elaine began to cry, bitterly, saying that she felt sorry for the boy because he knew he was living with such a great curse and did not lose heart. Then she turned to the god of healing and asked him for help, because this guy was sacrificing himself to protect them from his subordinates. The boss burst into tears again because he was so tired of proving to everyone that he was actually completely healthy and did not need any treatment. So he got up and, with his hand over his face, began to walk toward the exit, explaining his decision so that he had nothing more to say. Elaine said at the last minute that she was a priestess of healers, so no matter how strong the curse was, she could at least slow its manifestation. As soon as the young man stopped in his tracks, he felt an unfamiliar energy approaching behind him, and it belonged to the Order of Healers. A minute later, the system informed the boss that all protective effects had been removed, and then he turned his head to the interlocutor and asked what she had done. The young lady opened her mouth wide and loudly shouted that she was a priestess, serving a great mission of healing people from various diseases. After a short pause, the lady asked the leader if she could join his group and walk further with them. At first, the guy wondered if she really said what he heard, but LA continued to say that she did not need money or fame at all. The only thing she asks is to be allowed to follow them because she likes the way they treat each other. The player realized that in any case, they would have to search for the priest, and it would take a lot of money, especially with his average level. However, he was interested in the suggestion that this participant needed neither money nor fame, so they would keep the preservation. After that, the system issued a message that they could accept LA into the group under special conditions, which means absolutely free of charge. The guy froze in his tracks in surprise because the system confirmed that he could actually do it, and he hadn't even thought about it. However, he still could not explain to himself why he had such luck in getting new players to join his team, and it was definitely not because of charisma. But he simply cannot refuse Elaine either, because the fact that she is a mid-level priestess and wants to join them is absolute luck. For several minutes, he continued to stand in one place and stare at one point, thinking that this was not the first strange situation in the game that had happened to him. Then he recalled his image from the last game and suggested that perhaps there was some special treatment for past runners. While she was waiting for at least some response, she began to worry and asked if the gentleman really doubted the Order's abilities. For some reason, the guy suspected the developers in such situations because they would definitely want to get all the benefits if he became a runner with their help. So he began to explain to the girl in a serious tone that everyone in his team was putting their lives on the line and that her determination might not be enough to survive. When everything was finally over and the boss left LA's library, her colleagues came to her and saw her condition and did not understand what could have happened. As soon as the boss met with his subordinates, Lena happily emphasized that the gentleman's expression changed, and she wondered what he was doing with the priestess. At this time, Elaine leaned over her desk and wept bitterly because she felt very sorry for her guest and considered him unhappy. She then invited her colleagues to come closer to her in order to pray together for Wilhelm, who had left them. It had been an hour since the three left the healing order, and during that time they had managed to take a seat in an inn on an unfamiliar street. After chewing another piece of meat, the girl turned to the chef and asked why his face was so radiant, but his expression was still horrified. Caesar looked at his colleagues and agreed with the young lady's opinion, so he clarified that something might have angered the manager. The guy put his hands on his face and said that, to tell the truth, he does not want to blame anyone, but there is something that worries him. The subordinates even stopped doing anything and froze in their seats, and the guy continued that they could not cope with even the easiest tasks. For some reason, Caesar turned to face Lena and called her a slut, saying that she must have done something wrong again. The lady could not keep silent, and in turn began to blame her partner, but the boss intervened and emphasized that he did not blame anyone for this. As soon as the two calmed down, the guy closed his eyes and calmly said that the accusation made no sense and that there was a completely different solution to this problem. And after a short pause, the boss said that he was now talking about eloquence, which gives you a chance to get what you want almost without using force. Lena didn't like it and said so right away, but her supervisor shouted that a thief like her should have this skill. After the player shouted, he realized that he had overreacted and, covering his face with his hand, calmly said that he would demonstrate everything by his own example. And literally, at that very second, he turned to face the bar and called for the cook, who immediately came to their table. The gentleman was very stout in appearance, and his face was marked by large, round eyes. When he approached, he asked how he could help. The manager asked the man to look at their table and see the large number of dishes his team had ordered for dinner. The kitchen worker emphasized that it really wasn't a small meal, and then the chef said that thanks to them, they made quite a good profit today. After that, the system gave a message that eloquence was activated, so the guy asked if they could count on bonuses. The subordinates froze in their seats in amazement, for they had never heard their master so beautifully lure people out of any benefit for himself. The cook stood silently for a few seconds because he needed to think about it, and then he said that of course he could arrange it. And literally a second later, he announced that he would bring everyone a glass of wine at the expense of the establishment. His subordinates were shocked by this development, to put it mildly. After that, Wilhelm turned his head to his partners and emphasized that this method can be used to get the things you need without using force. Suddenly, Caesar loudly put his hand on the table, which attracted the cook's attention, and then began to say that this eloquence would open up new opportunities. Then, the gentleman in the black cloak said that he understood everything the chef was saying and turned to the cook and emphasized that he must have misunderstood. And a second later, when he added that the manager actually wanted something else, the gamer was mentally torn apart by what his assistant was doing. When the kitchen worker saw that the thugs started to get up from the table, he said that if they were violent, he would call the guards. Caesar calmly asked the question about whether the interlocutor knew that they had just left the police station. Then the assistant added, smiling sarcastically, that the boss had destroyed half the city and was not only let go, but was also apologized for in the end. Wilhelm was simply beside himself with rage in his mind, because first of all, he was angry with his assistant, and secondly, it was not really so. After a short pause, the cook asked if the gentleman was from some criminal organization he hadn't even heard of. Then the man gritted his teeth strangely and said that it seemed they had come here for a reason, because they knew how important this tavern was to other organizations. As soon as the gentleman spoke the last word, men holding various weapons began to appear from the ceiling and other walls of the room. The chef asked the guests to show their true colors, and the manager got to his feet and was disappointed that there would be another fight. Caesar, on the contrary, was pleased with this, so he raised his sword up and emphasized that with the help of eloquence, you can get whatever you want. Swinging his sword, the assistant gleefully announced that he was taking over the entire tavern. Lena, who was standing on the side, supporting her partner because she wanted it so much. Suddenly, the system issued a notification that the guests had encountered a secret group that was hiding in the establishment at the time. The main one among these participants was a cook who watched the battle and saw that half of them could not even withstand one blow. Because of this, he began to shout loudly to his men to disperse, because they would all be killed if they stood in a bunch. At that moment, Lena approached the man from behind, tapped him on the shoulder, and addressed him as if he were the owner, asking if he had forgotten about her. Next, the young lady showed her dagger, which she began to lick with her tongue, again clarifying whether the gentleman had forgotten it. It was only after this gesture that the man first screamed in pain and then tried to say which organization the lady belonged to, but he could not because he was in pain. At some point, the men who were hiding in this tavern began to run away, shouting loudly that these guests were just some monsters. Several hours had passed since the battle began, and now they were sitting at a table where the cook was apologizing to the 3 tavern guests. The man went on to say that one could guess how cruel the manager was by his face and blamed himself a bit for not realizing it right away. Wilhelm addressed the hostages and emphasized that it was too late to regret anything, so they should not waste time on it. Then the young man pointed his index finger at his assistant Lena and asked how men could know her, while the lady smiled broadly. The so-called cook replied that he knew the lady because she was a member of their organization and was considered a first-class criminal. Once she personally destroyed one of their units and disappeared, and since then the rest of the organization has been hunting her. The boss was a little scared by these words because he clearly did not expect that someone was looking for Lena, and the girl was very happy about it. It was only now that Wilhelm realized that all this time, a criminal organization was on their heels, wanting to get rid of his former colleague. And from this, we can conclude that they are also considered criminals by everyone, which is why they were treated so strangely even during the first communication. The leader realized that he could not change anything now, so he stood up and started walking towards the attackers and asked if they had been following them all this time. The men didn't have time to answer because the guy said that since they were members of the organization and now they were also witnesses, they had to be killed immediately. These words seriously frightened the prisoners because they seemed to them like a bolt from the blue that they could not control on their own. After saying that, the boss turned to the exit and turned to Lena and asked her to clean up better this time than the last. In the last seconds, the cook shouted loudly that from now on, the tavern could belong to them, and they, in turn, would obey them. This offer made Wilhelm stop, but he emphasized that now the attackers are ready to offer anything to save their lives. The chief among the criminals sadly replied that this was not even the point, because their organization was not as smooth as they would like it to be. Lena came up close to the so-called cook and looked him straight in the eye and asked him if these problems were not due to the fact that they were left without her. The giant knelt down and bent his head down and said that their organization is not the same as it was a few months ago. And it's all about their newcomer, who is a rather strange fellow, but also smart, and one of his peculiarities is that he has a snake's tongue. As soon as he arrived, he immediately proposed a new business plan to the CEO, and his idea eventually began to bring in some profit. However, because of this, their tavern, the Den of Freedom, was not in the best position, as it eventually stopped generating any income. Then the chief of the attackers shed a small tear and said that they were already in a bad light because of security problems, and now new difficulties were added. Having calmed down a bit, the man added that according to rumors, they knew that the young man started out as an ordinary thief who stole on the streets of the town. And finally, the gentleman looked directly at the manager and said that under his leadership, they would achieve great things. Not hearing a word in response, the chef continued to say that with their strength and the charismatic face of the chef, they could reach the top. At this time, Lena raised her dagger above the interlocutor's head and told him to shut up because the boss doesn't like people talking so much. However, she did not have time to do anything because Wilhelm ordered her to stop and said that he wanted to accept the attacker's offer. The girl was seriously angry and began to say that these criminals would sell them at the first opportunity they had. The chief calmly said that they would not do that because if the organization found out that they had failed to stop them and had submitted, it would destroy them. And then it turns out that in any case, they will be deprived of their lives, so they have no choice but to accept them into their team. The young man then suggested that they be reborn and swear allegiance to Wilhelm Meyer in order to save their miserable lives. In a few minutes, the system showed that the criminals from the criminal organization were now subordinate to them and that the inn in the alley was now their territory. The giant cook knelt down in front of the chef and kissed his shoe, and the system informed him that he could take a part of the profit. After that, another message appeared, saying that now Wilhelm could create his own organization because he already had all the components and just needed to choose a name. The young man decided to consider all his subordinates his family, and in a few minutes, he announced the name of the organization, the Black Mountain Association. The system then displayed a message that Wilhelm would receive additional experience and skill points when he created the organization. Finally, there was a reminder that organization is a key element of the chef game, so you need to create it in the best possible way. As soon as all the organizational issues were over, Caesar turned to the manager and asked questions to find out the plans for the future. The young man, looking at himself in a serious tone, replied that the main goal of the Black Mountain Association was to overcome the maze. Lena looked into Wilhelm's face from the right side and asked if this was too simple a goal for them since they were capable of more. The boss had to clarify things further and said that power and income are also important, but he personally looks for much more than that. After all, the labyrinth is teeming with powerful monsters, and no one has ever managed to match their strength. After saying this, he clenched his hands into fists and raised them up, smiled broadly, and said he was ready to fight the strongest of monsters. The boy was so enthusiastic about his words that he called everyone to run forward, but only Caesar and Lena joined him. The men who had just joined the group froze in their seats in amazement because they did not understand what they were supposed to do now. At the same time, in the eastern part of the city, in the thickets, the boy was reading a newspaper with news that someone had seized an entire tavern in half a day. It turned out that he was reading the news for a man with long black hair who was sitting on a chair. The young man suggested that a new organization could have done it. This large and broad-shouldered gentleman's name was Thomas, and after hearing this, he quickly rose to his feet and said seriously that it was time for him to intervene. At this time, Wilhelm told his assistants that he did not care about any titles that could be obtained during the maze. Looking down on the city from the highest point, the young man spread his arms to the side and said that he just wanted to become the best and go through the maze himself. The system decided to summarize everything the guy said, so it displayed a message about the association's goals and a list of intentions. Further, the new message said that the notoriety of the criminals who sided with the chief would be added to the one the group already had. One of his colleagues came up to the so-called cook and frightenedly began to say that they had managed to get out of the situation, but what they should do next. The man replied that it seemed the boy already knew about everything, and that he also heard rumors that the young man had hired a damn monster to protect him. And while this boy was walking the streets of the city with the sheet, looking for something, a policeman noticed him and ordered him to stop. When the police officer approached the young man, he asked him if he didn't know that since recently it was forbidden to carry large weapons on the street. After listening carefully, the blond boy asked why they had adopted such rules, since this had never happened before. The policeman remembered the images of Wilhelm and his assistants, and so he said that there were some people here who were destroying everything around them. The man added that these newcomers were released after being detained and that their leader is a member of the Adventurers Guild, so it's not so clear. It is precisely because of such situations that we have to take extra precautions to prevent such cases from happening. And after that, the policeman said that he was sorry, but the guy's partner had to hand over all the weapons he had. The young man continued to hold the sheet in his hands, and without thinking about the meaning of all the words he heard, he smiled broadly and agreed to these rules. However, when he turned his gaze to Mr. Thomas, his face immediately changed, as he realized that his confirmation had made him seriously angry. In 1 second, the man drew his sword back and began to swing hard at the policeman because he was not going to follow the rules. When Wilhelm's group arrived at the central square, the system informed them that their notoriety had exceeded the limit of 1,000. And this happens because the actions of all members of the organization affect this value, and if it is large, they move to another level of crime. However, there is one significant disadvantage. They become the target of other serious organizations, and the manager has already begun to catch slanted glances. Lena also noticed strange looks at them, but she didn't understand why they attracted the attention of people around them, but she even liked it. The bosses think that since they have such attention from the very beginning, they can quickly develop the organization and bathe in gold. Looking at his subordinates, the guy realized that they also like it. So in time, he will be able to control these stupid people without any problems. Suddenly, a memory from the last game came to him, where he witnessed the failure of Rodrigo Eldrigo, who was killed by one of the monsters. Upon returning to the real world, the executive decided to stay in the city for a while and postpone conquering the maze for later. However, his thoughts kept him busy, and he gritted his teeth and said to himself that he was talking out of turn because he wanted to do better than that guy. So, turning his head first to Lena, the chief said that their Dark Mountain Association would conquer the maze despite any obstacles. Then he turned his gaze to Caesar and added that they were on a one-way road, and it was going straight to hell, right into their fears. Then the young man turned his gaze forward, paused, looked at the people walking on the square, and added that only a miracle could save them. He turned to his assistants again and asked in a serious tone whether they were ready to go through all this with him and create this miracle. Caesar, folding his arms across his chest, clearly answered that he did not, and the girl gently replied that she was not going to fulfill this strange request. Lena then emphasized loudly that this was too much, because even if the gentleman became a big shot, he could not be covered up so immediately. The subordinate added that they certainly understand their boss, but the game has just begun and there is no reason to rush into anything. The guy could not understand when these two became so rational, and turned around and sadly replied that maybe it was not the right time. Caesar offered to finish all the business with the organization first, and the manager replied that he needed to buy a map with the maze's layout first. Suddenly, the system issued a red alert, and a second later, a new notification appeared that their inn had been attacked. In just a few minutes, the attackers managed to deal with all the men present in the room and even make a little bit of a mess. As it turned out, the attackers were a little boy and his bodyguard, Thomas. The young man approached the main man and emphasized that he wanted to come earlier. The so-called cook asked the interlocutor where he was going in such a hurry and whether he was acting without any permission from his organization. The young man, holding his head, looked down and emphasized that the head of the group of criminals was very smart to have guessed his intentions. The man smiled broadly and said that one shouldn't expect anything else from a child. All these are very obvious things. After that, the man raised his eyebrows in anger and added that the boy could have lured the three culprits out and dealt with them, but he chose a different path. Without even giving me a chance to answer, the cook continued to say that the guy, just like Wilhelm, was always leading some thug around. The blonde young man was enraged by this comparison, and you could see it in the way his expression changed from angry to menacing. Having mastered his emotions, the boy turned to Mr. Thomas and told him that this chief among the criminals was a traitor to his comrades. Having carefully listened to this information, the large black-haired man paused for a few seconds because he wanted to carefully analyze what he had heard. Suddenly, tears began to pour from his eyes, and he quickly jumped to his feet, swung his weapon, and moved directly toward the traitor. However, he was unable to strike because Caesar appeared in the room at that moment and prevented this from happening by throwing the weapon in the opposite direction. The partner did not expect that anything could become an obstacle at all, so this development made him freeze and hardly move. The reaction of the young man who came with him was even brighter. He opened his mouth wide and began to shout loudly throughout the room because of who he saw. Then his whole body began to shake with fear. Caesar turned his head back and noticed the young man and addressed him as if they had known each other for a long time. The boy decided not to despair and pointed his index finger at the guest and emphasized that he had guessed that it was they who had stolen his gold. After these words, the subordinate realized that he just thought he recognized this guy, but in fact he was seeing him for the first time. As soon as the young man heard these words, he began to laugh out loud, saying, how could the man forget him, since not much time had passed since their meeting? Despite the fact that it was so terrible that the young man will never be able to forget it, no matter how much he wants to. So he decided to remind Caesar that he had tied it to his sword and carried it through the streets of the town in front of everyone who was there. It took the gentleman in the black cloak a little while to remember anything, so he tried to look at the young man's face more and more. And in just a few seconds, the memory of how this boy robbed his boss and humiliated him to a great extent came to him. The interlocutor confirmed that it was him, and at that moment, Wilhelm and a second assistant named Lena entered the room. Hearing a familiar voice, the young man cautiously turned his head back, with his mouth wide open to see if it was the one he was thinking of. As soon as the manager in this pickpocket met his eyes, the man immediately recognized his first offender in this game. At this point, Mr. Thomas decided not to waste the opportunity while everyone was busy, so he used magic and started moving towards Caesar. No matter how busy Wilhelm was, he managed to see this bad intention and began to call out loudly to his assistant to draw him to the danger. However, it was too late to react, so when the attacker touched Caesar with his hands, they began to walk back together. But Mr. Thomas used more force in the last seconds and was able to push his opponent out into the street through a brick wall. An opening was formed in this wall that corresponded to the physique of the subordinate, who was sitting against the next wall with his head and eyes on the ground. At this time, the people who remained in the room began to look at the place where a few minutes ago there was a price and an intact wall. Suddenly, the boy began to laugh loudly to attract attention, and when everyone started looking at him, he said that he had a strong subordinate. Wilhelm sadly tilted his head down, but Lena, on the contrary, did not know this attacker and therefore did not understand what reasons they had to hate each other. Then the boss gathered his thoughts and looked directly at the interlocutor and emphasized that he had thoroughly destroyed the base of his association. But a second later, the manager exploded with emotion and wanted to attack the boy right then and there, but Lena managed to catch him. While the girl was holding her boss's hands, he was trying to viciously prove that his Caesar was stronger than such blows, and that is why he was alive. The blonde young man, looking closely into the eyes of his interlocutor, sarcastically emphasized that the gentleman was completely unaware of Mr. Thomas's blows. After all, this man is nicknamed the Piercing Wind. He was an adventurer who managed to get to the depths of the labyrinth and lost his comrades in the process. And so, he was defeated at the threshold of the unknown. And perhaps because he could not accept the fact that his friends had died, he became like that. He managed to get out of the maze on his own, and it was only thanks to this escape that he alone managed to survive the task. And because he could not come to terms with the fact that he had left his loved ones in the maze, he simply went crazy. While the young man was telling the story of his assistant, the latter, standing in front of Caesar, told him to get up because then his comrades would die by his hand. The interlocutor continued to sit in the same place, in the same position, not even a single muscle moving on his face. In the room, the young man furiously tried to convey to Wilhelm that he could not become a great thief because of their meeting. But a second later, he added that he was lucky enough to find Mr. Tomei and hold him hostage. The boy is very proud of this act, because even the best criminals of the guild could not catch this giant. Suddenly, the pickpocket stopped in his story, because he realized that he had gotten a little carried away with his story. At this time, the manager said that he had actually stopped listening to all this nonsense in the first half because he was not interested at all. The young man, obviously, did not want to be treated this way, so he made a terrible face and shouted that today, Caesar would be finished. This reaction of the young man made Wilhelm laugh, so he emphasized with a wide smile that even the priest of the witnesses of the end could not do it. As soon as the chief finished the last sentence, he saw his assistant move toward the young man, holding her weapon. Then Lena took out a dagger and put it on her shoulder, leaned over to the boy, and emphasized that now there was no one to protect him. In a second, her face changed, her eyes became bulging, and her smile sarcastic, and the lady said she didn't care about the guard. And after that, the girl straightened up sharply and waved her weapon, saying that her boss did not like people who talked a lot. The boss was very frightened by the movements of his subordinate and mentally began to beg Lena to stop, because she was just a child. However, it was not this that stopped the girl, but the fact that a person she did not expect to see so early in the day had returned to the room. This person was Mr. Thomas, who felt that his friend was in danger and therefore burst into the room and immediately rushed to the attacker. As soon as the young man realized that he was not in danger, he began to smile ominously, emphasizing that his bodyguard no longer abandoned his friends. But then, something happened that made the boy abruptly change his joy to surprise and freeze in place. It turns out that Caesar also returned to the room after Mr. Thomas and grabbed his leg and began to hold it, preventing him from moving forward. As soon as the two thugs made eye contact, Wilhelm's assistant told his opponent to never lose focus, and at that moment, threw him back. The victim flew a few meters and landed near one of the walls, while Caesar managed to turn in his direction and start moving. However, he did not come too close, and leaving some space between them, he told the young man's guard to take his sword in his hands. And after the words were said, the subordinate's eyes lit up with a purple light, and the system reported that he wanted to fight Mr. Thomas one-on-one. Wilhelm and Lena, standing next to each other, were shocked by the way the events were unfolding and could not even say anything to their friend. The young man's bodyguard began to slowly rise to his feet in order to accept this challenge with dignity and not immediately appear weak. But the system knew everything about him, so it issued notifications that he was tormented by remorse for leaving his comrades. Therefore, in order to start the fight, Thomas began to project the fear of the maze onto Caesar in order to incite anger and hatred. And finally, the system reported that the man had never felt so desperate, so he was exceeding his body's limits. Wilhelm and Lena hadn't moved since the previous moment. They were still standing in the same position and still didn't know what to do. At that moment, the manager was covered with cold drops of sweat from worry about how the fight might end. The only one who was not worried about anything was Caesar, who, on the contrary, liked such events, so he just laughed out loud before the battle. And suddenly, in 1 second, everything changed, and Mr. Thomas jumped high up and swung his sword in front of his opponent's face. And it was from that moment that the battle between the two giant men began. It was so powerful that even sparks flew from their weapons. Wilhelm and his assistant were quietly watching all this, and in 1 second, they felt a strong gust of wind that spread Thomas's sword. The manager realized that this was a pretty strong opponent, so he turned to Lena and asked if she wanted to help her partner. At this time, the two giants were engaged in a life-and-death duel, each of them exerting maximum strength during each blow. Finally, the young lady decided to answer, and without taking her eyes off the fight, said that she specialized only in covert killings. Mr. Thomas barely had time to take the correct stance to stop the kick his opponent was about to deliver. After that, his anger reached its maximum, so the man swung his sword wide and threw Caesar a little into the air. As soon as Lena saw this, she hid behind Wilhelm's back in surprise and fear, and he could not believe what this gentleman had done. The man in the black cloak was seriously angry that he could be pushed up so easily, and he didn't even prevent it. Suddenly, the system issued a red alert, warning him to be careful because Thomas was about to use his devastating technique. This happened a second later, when the man sharply raised his sword, which was illuminated by the purple color of the applied magic, and wanted to strike his opponent with it. And he managed to do almost everything he had planned, because after the collision, there was a small explosion that caused even more destruction in the room. There was a lot of dust around, which had not yet settled enough to see anything properly, but Wilhelm was already calling out to Caesar because of his excitement. Suddenly, a young man approached the man, who had been hiding behind a small board all this time so that nothing would harm him. As soon as the supervisor paid attention to him, the boy began to smile broadly, emphasizing that his assistant had died at the hands of Mr. Thomas. Then the young man turned to his bodyguard and asked him to look at Lena and her boss, who were shaking in fear of such a force. The man turned in their direction and began to walk slowly, and his friend emphasized that the two were just watching their friend die. Wilhelm was still looking at the hole in the wall and couldn't understand how it could happen that Caesar lost, and Lena was still hiding behind the leader. The man has only now realized that the quests he considered useless and unimportant at the beginning have already caused him harm at this level. Suddenly, these thoughts were interrupted by Lena, who gathered the courage to come forward and pulled out her dagger and said that it was her time to fight. The boss was angry with the girl for not intervening immediately, and now she used a skill called illusion. And exact copies of her began to appear around the room, so it would be difficult to find the real one to attack. Lena was happy that her opponent could not catch her, so she moved quickly and then realized that he was very slow in his movements. Therefore, she concluded that she needed to get to the vital organs and that the battle could end there. And without hesitation, the young lady threw several of her daggers at Mr. Thomas, but it didn't go as she had hoped. All these weapons simply bounced off the opponent and began to fall directly towards Lena, who fell to the floor and began to cover herself from her own daggers. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Caesar appeared through a hole in the wall and emphasized that his partner should not have interfered in his battle. As soon as he finished speaking, he quickly flew into the room and went straight to Mr. Thomas, with whom he had not yet fully understood. The boy's guard put his hands forward to protect himself, and so they began to hold hands, each trying to demonstrate their strength. Caesar looked into his opponent's eyes and asked him why the man was so concerned about his dead comrades. Without waiting for any response, the gentleman in the black cloak smiled slyly and suggested that Thomas could have been betrayed by a friend at the most important moment. As Caesar said the last words, he noticed the black-haired man's expression change, and he could see the confusion and incomprehension on his face. But Wilhelm's subordinate decided not to stop there and continue to verbally attack his opponent in order to bring him to some kind of emotion. So a second later, Caesar added that the opponent was simply weak at that moment, and that's why everything happened exactly as it did. Without receiving a single word in response, Wilhelm's assistant illuminated his eyes with a red light and emphasized that the man still did not understand how the world works. And after a short pause, he said that in such a world, there is no place for weaklings. The boss was shocked that his subordinate could speak so eloquently. Lena, who was standing next to the manager, leaned over and began to smile broadly because she was pleased with the way her partner was behaving. When Caesar began to put more pressure on Mr. Thomas, he angrily said that a weakling like him would never be able to defeat him. All this time, the young man's bodyguard did not react to the words spoken, and all that remained unchanged were the tears that flowed from both eyes. And all because he was concentrating on his thoughts, in which the image of a girl crying and asking him to save her life appeared. Thomas was overcome with rage, which forced him to grit his teeth and use all his strength to fight the attacker. In a second, he just exploded emotionally and began to shout loudly with his mouth wide open, while he was clutching Caesar's hands tightly. Everyone who watched from the outside froze in their seats in shock. Even the young man who brought the man here was surprised by his behavior. Suddenly, the system issued a message that Thomas's rage had exceeded the point where he could no longer cope and withstand its pressure. At this time, Wilhelm looked down and could not believe that his subordinate had almost defeated such a strong opponent. And Thomas could no longer stop the process inside him that he had started with the help of his rage, remembering the past that brought him pain. The only one who was happy about the man's condition was Caesar, who kept saying that his opponent had been too confident in himself and his abilities all this time. The boy who came here with his bodyguard didn't even know how to help him because they had never experienced such situations before, so he just stood there. The assistant manager came closer to the black gentleman and looked him in the eye to demonstrate that he still had enough strength to deal with him to the end. So after saying these words, he began to press on Thomas with all his might, and the man knelt down one by one because he could no longer resist. The only thing that remained unchanged was the expression on the victim's face, with tears constantly flowing from his eyes that the man could not stop. Caesar, in turn, took advantage of his opponent's condition and continued to put pressure on him, namely by shouting to show who was the king of battles. Wilhelm, watching this, simply could not believe that his assistant's actions were completely absent of any logic, because he was just shouting. Mr. Thomas could not withstand this pressure and raised his head up and screamed loudly, after which he fell face first to the floor without moving. Immediately after that, the system issued a message that Caesar was able to win a one-on-one victory, and therefore, his strength increased significantly. The first to congratulate her partner was Lena, who was sincerely happy for him, and the young man who came here with Thomas was standing there, crying in fear. But the leader reasoned that Caesar was given a rather stingy reward called Talent of Resilience. For a quest of this level, something better would have been better. When the assistant returned to his comrades, he suddenly stopped, and the first thing that was strange was that he stopped blinking and moving. Then he began to cough up blood, and the boss was so absorbed in his thoughts, rejoicing in his victory, that he did not even notice such terrible bells. Lena was the first to notice these strange actions in her partner's behavior, so she turned to her supervisor to ask how they could help the thug who had already fallen. Caesar lost consciousness and woke up in his subconscious, where a special event began that would turn everything upside down. As it turned out, this was Wilhelm's assistant's worst nightmare, and in it, he came to his supervisor and began to tell him about all his shameful deeds. The man did not believe it because it was not obvious that the gentleman in black clothes had participated in any fight. After saying that, the boss turned his head to the other side and did not want to look at his assistant, who did not meet his expectations when it came to using his force. Caesar was upset that William did not praise him, but rather expressed his dissatisfaction and began to tell him how he should have acted. And finally, the chief emphasized that horrible actions and shameful behavior are in no way suitable for his large, newly created organization. There was an awkward pause between the men, which was broken by the manager, who told Caesar that he was relieving him of his job and that he could leave. These words upset the subordinate, who threw out all his rage, and because of this, blue lightning formed in the sky and struck his sword. After that, Caesar realized that it was definitely a dream, because Wilhelm could not have said that to him in real life, and so he attacked him with a sword. However, there was no continuation, because the victim woke up in a hospital room and at first did not realize where he was. But when he sat down on the edge of the bed, he noticed that on the bedside table near the flowers, there was a small note addressed to him, but it was not clear from whom. When the man opened it, he read that he had to look for his comrades in the town hall, and for some reason, this text did not make him happy, but rather angry. At that time, in the eastern district of the town, Wilhelm was in the town hall and was very outraged when he heard the answer to his question. After all, the man was told that Mr. Thomas was the owner of a thicket in the western part of the town, because he did not look like an important person. The young lady who worked at the reception desk in the town hall had purple hair and looked down and emphasized that Thomas used to be a very influential person. Then the young lady looked up at Wilhelm and said that according to the rules of the maze world, part of the territory became the property of his organization. After a short pause, the girl added that this Thomas was causing them a lot of problems because he was constantly getting into fights with criminal organizations. Then the man turned to the young man who had come with them and began to accuse him of wanting to appropriate the land for himself. After the manager calmed down, he turned to the girl at the reception and asked if he shouldn't get all the property he had. The girl listened to everything carefully, and before answering, she smiled sweetly and calmly said that everything was very simple and clear. And turning her gaze to the boy, she said that part of the territory was going to be owned by this cute blonde boy. The news made Wilhelm angry, and he began to threaten the young man with a sword for not telling them anything when they went to this place. The boy began to piteously ask for mercy and to take him at least as a slave, because he had no one to go to after the death of the guard. When Wilhelm heard the word slave, he froze with his mouth wide open in surprise because he did not expect the young man to propose such extreme measures. Immediately after receiving the documents for the property, everyone went to Thomas's estate to inspect everything and figure out what to do with it. As soon as they went inside, there was almost nothing there, and in some places, there was all kinds of junk lying around. The boss could not believe that it was the property of such a person. Therefore, in order to understand everything better, the man turned to the young man, calling him a crab, and asked him if he wanted to explain something. The blonde immediately realized that he was being addressed, so he stopped in his tracks and turned his head to look the other man in the eye, and to emphasize that even though he was a slave, he should not be called a crab. Saying these words, the boy broke out in a cold sweat of fear. And he was right to be so worried, because Wilhelm just emotionally exploded after these words, and it was so strong that Lena could barely hold him with both hands. But this did not calm the man down. He still continued to blame the young man for the fact that they had inherited the estate in such a bad condition. At this time, Cled, who had come with them from the town hall, stopped in her tracks because her attention was drawn to a teddy bear that was pierced with metal. When the blonde man saw this interest, he said that there were a lot of such things here because they connected Thomas to his memories and fears. This answer made Lena laugh out loud, but she kept holding her boss so that he wouldn't get into trouble. Having calmed down a bit, the girl emphasized that they need to be careful, especially in such places, because there can be many harmful things. Finally, Wilhelm was able to control his emotions, and, silent, he began to look carefully around for small, interesting details. Then he began to think to himself that having a territory was better than not having one at all, but this estate was simply not possible to use at the moment. But they need to think about what they should do next, while the rest of the people present go in different directions to inspect the rooms. Cled, who was standing next to the new owner, holding her glasses, said that perhaps the best solution would be to demolish everything. These words surprised the boss, because for him, it was a very drastic decision that he was not ready to make, let alone implement. The only thing that reminds him of this room is the beginning of a game in a maze where there are a lot of traps at every step, but they did not bother Caesar. After the memories, Wilhelm returned to reality and folded his arms across his chest and began to look at the walls of the room he was in again. And in a second, he plunged into his dreams, in which he completely demolished the building and built a storage facility and a new base for the Dark Mountain Association. Everyone who came to this place paid attention to the leader, who changed his face and his expression became strange and mysterious, something even Lena had never seen before. In order not to interrupt her husband, Claude gently leaned over to the assistant and quietly asked if the gentleman always made such grimaces, and received a positive answer. Then Wilhelm clenched his hands into fists and raised them to chest level, smiling, and mentally asking Caesar to come back because he was missed. At this time, a subordinate of the chief was walking calmly on the main square of the town, not paying attention to the people passing by. After all, the gentleman was so immersed in his memories of the dream and how he was reproached by his supervisor for the way the task was performed and how it should have been performed. Suddenly, a man's voice interrupted these memories as he addressed Caesar as an ordinary passerby, but emphasized that the gentleman had a large sword. Wilhelm's subordinate stopped and slowly turned his head to the person who was addressing him and asked who the man was. Without waiting for an answer, he added that he should leave if he wanted to live, but the interlocutor smilingly said that he could not be defeated so easily. This statement made Caesar seriously angry, so he quickly approached the interlocutor and looked him straight in the eye and asked if he really decided to joke. The man continued to calmly say that there were rumors that a legendary fight between two bulls took place in the eastern part of the city. Of course, this attracted the attention of the gentleman in the black cloak, because he knew perfectly well that he was being told about his battle. And the interlocutor continued that it is also assumed that only the greatest masters of their craft could leave such traces after the battle. Caesar didn't say anything after he finished, just continued to stand there and think about something, looking at the man opposite him. However, then the gentleman who was telling all this jumped up and started shouting that he did not believe in all this because it could have been a regular fight. The man in the black cloak is already gritting his teeth in anger because rumors of a skirmish, not a great battle, will continue to spread in the town. At first, he decided to find out why they thought so, and the interlocutor, raising his foot to the level of the pile, replied that there were no martial arts there at all. Then the gentleman abruptly changed his posture and said that you need to aim at weak points, and then you can strike an effective blow to the opponent. Suddenly, the man abruptly changed his pose to another one, this time with his hands covering his face, and he added that flexibility and maneuverability would lead the fighter to victory. A second later, the other man changed his stance again and was standing with one arm outstretched forward, saying that this was the art of the 100 steps. After saying this, the man turned to Caesar and asked him how he felt about it and whether the swordsman wanted to challenge him to a fight. Without waiting for an answer, the gentleman activated the magic that illuminated his body in blue and emphasized that then their names would be remembered for a long time. After a short pause, the gentleman still hoped to convince the thug not to lose his chance and get the prizes if he registered right now. At first, Caesar was a little hesitant about whether he really needed it now, but then, just for fun, he decided to agree and asked where to register. At this time, at Tomi's estate, Lena tried to teach the blonde man how to use his dagger, and he was quite good at it. The system reported that the slave had passed the first training level, and the girl was pleased with this and said happily that the boy had even outrun the boss. Wilhelm did not react to these words, because then Cled turned to him and asked when Caesar would come, since her workday had long since ended. In his mind, the man was simply out of his mind with rage, so he turned to his subordinate and asked where the hell he was and why he hadn't come yet. To entertain the young lady a bit, the manager first apologized for the assistant's delay and then said he wanted to ask the lady a few questions. Cled looked at the interlocutor with a playful glance, then said sweetly and lightly smiling that she would answer any question. And Wilhelm began to say that when he first came here, he looked around and noticed that things were not going well in this part of the city. The young lady just sat there and listened attentively to the continuation of the story about how even the town hall could not put things in order for the betterment of the local residents. After a short pause, the supervisor emphasized that he was confused by the fact that the state employee agreed to take them here after hours. And then he asked if they had noticed Caesar's potential and wanted to lure him away to use him for their own purposes in the future. Cled looked down and replied that the gentleman was cutting everything off his shoulder, and it was not surprising because he was the leader of a new organization that was on everyone's lips. Then the girl looked up and began to look the boss directly in the eye, hinting that such help on her part might be out of personal interest. Wilhelm's cheeks immediately flushed from these words, but in his mind, he was still trying to understand what the young lady meant. In the era of the Great Templars, the difficulty of the levels in the maze increased very quickly and dramatically. But in exchange, items were given that increased the basic characteristics of the character, which is why they became simply irreplaceable. This led to the fact that players started playing even in the dark and enjoyed farming some enemies in different events. Those who were the first to find an object were very happy, while those who were a step away from finding it were upset and screaming at their comrades. That is why a gap was formed between all the players, which depended on the object with which they passed the game levels. And there were those who did not have any objects, so they were rejected by society, and so they tried to reduce this gap by their hard work. And what they chose for themselves was martial arts, which they practiced constantly in a group of people dressed in white clothes. Of course, the effect of improving character control from training was not bad, but it didn't bring what the players would have liked to get. But no one dared to leave this business, because it somehow saved their position in the game and allowed them to stay here for a while. It was these people in white clothes who invited Caesar to their house, and as soon as he was in the room, one of the students got his head stuck in the wooden floor. The gentleman in the black cloak stopped in his tracks and began to smile broadly, for he saw it as just another leisure activity. Then he continued to look at the victim, emphasizing that he already liked it, and asked if this was the martial art they had talked about earlier. But the man who invited Caesar here angrily replied that he was an incompetent waver who was far from the art of the 100 steps. However, this development only made Wilhelm's subordinate happy, so he smiled broadly and emphasized that these fighters had chosen a strange name for their art. The gentleman in the old clothes was simply out of his mind from the anger that took over his body and emotions, because he did not think that anyone would mock them. And to bring the man to his senses, Caesar grabbed him by the shirt and emphasized that he was not interested in any weaklings and asked him to bring a worthy opponent. Without waiting for an answer, he added that if they didn't, he would just close this useless mug for losers in a second. The students who heard these threats began to fuss with each other because they expected to see a newcomer, not this monster. Suddenly, behind Caesar, they heard the footsteps of a not-so-small man, and as soon as the disciples saw who it was, they froze in their seats. When the gentleman in the black cloak turned his head, he saw a rather large opponent who was furious at the chaos that was being created here. The man was also wearing white clothes, but his shirt barely fit because he looked like a rather pumped-up person. Caesar quickly pushed aside the loser who had brought him here and turned his attention to this giant because he expected a worthy battle. However, when he approached him and began to look him closely in the eye, in a few minutes, something happened that made the man very disappointed. After all, the gigantic man simply could not withstand the pressure of the gaze and first made a face, and then tears began to flow from his eyes. A second later, he ran past the opponent, heading for his comrades, covering his face with his hands and swimming loudly. As soon as the upset man got to his friends, they surrounded him in a circle and began to calm him down, saying that the coach would deal with the impudent man. Caesar was seriously enraged by this, because he was clearly expecting something more than just tears when he came here at the invitation to the battle. So he decided to demonstrate all his anger to all those present, and the men immediately felt that something very bad could happen to them. After all, the gentleman in the black cloak illuminated his eyes with a red light and said that he had hopes for this place, but was completely disappointed. Then Caesar turned his gaze to the one who had brought him here and began to reproach him for telling everything so beautifully, but in reality, it was not so. After saying this, he began to walk confidently toward the students who were standing closest to him, while the man looked them in the eye. And when he stopped a few meters away, he smiled broadly and emphasized that now they would have to avoid dying to prove their point about the art of combat. Of course, these threats were like a bolt from the blue for all those present, and they froze in their seats and did not know what to do in this case. Suddenly, one participant threw his sign on the ground because he could not stand the pressure and wanted the guest to finally start what he had planned. When the chief saw what his ward had done, he loudly addressed him, asking why he had thrown his sign confirming his path. The man, with tears in his eyes, angrily shouted that all this time he thought he could overcome any problems with his own strength. But looking at this monster, he realizes for sure that he can do nothing with it, and he points his index finger directly at Caesar. Wilhelm's assistant, in turn, simply smiled because he felt that everyone in the room was afraid of him. Then the gentleman who spoke continued to emphasize that this guest had so many different weapons that he would deal with them all in a matter of seconds. Finally, it began to dawn on the mainstream of these students that something was really wrong here, and Caesar did not look like a beginner in his field. And the system decided to add some information and said that this gentleman in the black cloak was just a subordinate who was subordinate to some player. After that, the man began to shout sadly. If this is just a ward, then it's scary to imagine what kind of monster his leader is, who destroys weaker players once or twice. Another student, holding his head, emphasized that they were doomed to die from the very beginning, and it could have happened at any time in their lives. The headmaster realized that this was already becoming a big problem, because all his students were beginning to doubt their abilities and capabilities. And although this guest looks very scary, one wonders who its owner is and how he behaves in such situations. The man who first made this fuss ran up to Caesar and began to tearfully beg him not to destroy it, and said that he was no longer a student of this place. The gentleman in the black cloak smiled sarcastically and asked a clarifying question to find out why the interlocutor was so desperate. However, Caesar did not wait for an answer, but swung his right hand, clenched into a fist, and slapped the man to bring him to his senses. Holding his shirt so that he didn't fall, the assistant emphasized that the fact that ordinary work will not allow you to go beyond your capabilities is quite natural. Caesar then leaned over to the victim and added that to reject this fact and cling to something crazy and unnecessary is the act of a pathetic coward. At this point, the rest of the students stood in their seats and listened attentively to all the words that their guest spoke because they resonated somewhere inside them. After saying that, the guest in the black cloak turned to all the students and asked them if they really thought they would deserve salvation in this way. And finally, the man clenched his hand into a fist, smiled sarcastically, and said that since they were so confident in themselves, they had to prove their immortality. The chief among these disciples again exploded with emotion and began to think that this Caesar was just a sick man who was ready to fight all the time. The rest of the students present began to shout loudly, throwing away their wooden certificates that they were indeed trained in martial arts. Some people blamed themselves for wasting their time on these useless trainings because they could have been farming in peace. The man who had brought Caesar here looked around in confusion and said that there was no need to make hasty decisions because there were so few of them left. Suddenly, a voice he had never heard before addressed the guest and menacingly ordered him not to touch his students with a finger. Of course, it attracted the attention of Wilhelm's assistant, and because of this, he stopped what he was doing and started looking in the direction where the voice was coming from. The unknown man came out of the secret room and at first did not want to show his face, so he remained in the shadows, where only his silhouette was visible. At the same time, events of a similarly large scale were unfolding at Thomas's estate, as Lena abruptly turned to her boss and ordered him to leave Cled. The man did not react to these words because he was immersed in his thoughts, pondering the meaning of the words he had heard. But a second later, he realized what Lena had said to him, and he turned his head sharply to her and mentally asked why he had to do this. With a wide smile, Cled turned to the young lady and asked her questions to clarify what she had done wrong in her opinion. Wilhelm's subordinate quickly ran up to her interlocutor and leaned into her face, emphasizing that she was taking too much liberty from the very beginning. A second later, Lena added that she hadn't liked the lady from the very beginning, and the manager couldn't understand why the two had a fight. The assistant then leaned even closer to Cled and said that she had said something about her personal interest in her boss a few seconds earlier. And that's why the subordinate swung her dagger to demonstrate how their association was gaining experience so quickly. Finally, Wilhelm decided to intervene in the showdown, and first he asked his assistant to stop threatening Cled. Lena was very upset about what had happened, so she angrily said that her husband had to choose between the two of them because it could not be otherwise. The manager still could not understand what his subordinate meant and did not know what choice she was asking him to make. The only thing he realized for sure was that it was better not to make things worse, so he decided to think things through carefully first. It was only when he thought about it that he realized that it was a fight to determine the attitude of the participants, and that Cled's words were the first blow. As Wilhelm continued to think, he emphasized to himself that his heart was indeed beating much faster than it normally does. After all, with his body and charisma, such a conflict was only a matter of time and could have happened at any time. At this time, while Lena was frantic with anger, Cled hugged herself and smiled sweetly, pretending that it didn't concern her. The boss realized that he needed to be perceptive in order to see what was hidden from view, but only very strong people have this ability. Therefore, he initially wanted to succeed in the fight by first conquering Cled with charisma, and only then using an ability called penetration. However, then something happened that made the gentleman quickly close his eyes to avoid seeing what was before his eyes. But when he opened his eyes, nothing changed. Everything around him was in some pink shades, and as it turned out, it was his subjective view. The boy who came with them to Thomas's estate had gotten a box of popcorn somewhere and was watching the situation and enjoying the treat. At this time, events were also unfolding quite quickly in the place where Caesar was staying, and the coach, who had not yet had time to heal, came out to the guest. The older gentleman, holding onto his belt, emphasized that Caesar, even with such power in him, came here and made such a mess. Then the system gave a message that this gentleman was an art trainer called 100 Steps, and his name was Cato. As soon as he opened his mouth and shouted what the guest was going to do, a powerful, cool air blew in. Caesar also felt these air currents on his face, but it did not frighten him. He simply smiled broadly in response. But he was already tired of being here, so he lifted his leg high up to demonstrate his skills. And as soon as his foot touched the floor, it immediately cracked into small pieces, between which a bright orange light glowed at first. The students managed to group up in time to withstand the explosion Caesar had set off a few seconds earlier. After a short pause, the guest began to laugh out loud, saying that he enjoyed mocking the weak. The trainer also decided to keep up and used his abilities, which manifested themselves through magic and 2 streams of turquoise color. Then the man opened his eyes and looked at his opponent and warned him not to expect a pardon from him, because he would not do it. Immediately after the last words were spoken, the older gentleman spread his arms and legs wide apart and loudly proclaimed the power of 100 steps. After that, the coach directed these 2 streams directly at Caesar, who had been standing in front of him all along, but not too close. Dodging this attack, the subordinate was thinking about how he could not win by dirty methods so as not to upset his boss again. After all, a true victory must be unquestionable and elegant, for this is what Wilhelm had hinted at in his terrible dream. Therefore, as soon as the coach launched his force towards Caesar again, and when they collided, there was a powerful explosion that destroyed a lot of things around. The gray-haired gentleman made every effort to stay on his feet in order to continue fighting if necessary. After the smoke and dust settled a little, the man first saw the silhouette of his opponent standing with his back to him, his head bowed down. But what he saw next made him freeze in his tracks, for Caesar turned sharply and it became apparent that he was holding the student who had taken the entire blow. The coach was seriously frightened, so he decided to ask for an end to the showdown and for no one to touch his students with a finger. As soon as Caesar released the victim, the chief immediately ran to him because he was worried about his condition, and the guest emphasized that such burns are not fatal. While Wilhelm's subordinate was walking across the room, the coach turned to him and called him a freak and asked him his real name. The gentleman in the black cloak, without turning to the interlocutor, replied that his name was Caesar, and he was a member of a new association called the Black Mountains. The gray-haired man listened attentively and emphasized that he had never heard of this association, but assumed that all its members had sold their souls to a demon. The guest did not like these accusations very much, so he stopped, turned his head back a little, and said that it did not concern him at all. The trainer continued to sit next to the victim who was lying on the floor, but still did not want to let Caesar go so easily. However, the gentleman in the black cloak made it clear that he wanted to learn perfect combat, but the teacher was not competent in the learning process. After a short pause, Caesar illuminated his eyes with a red light and said that he was not going to waste his time on them anymore. After these words, the gray-haired gentleman knelt down and told him never to come back to them again, and finally wished him to leave in peace. The last phrase made the guest laugh, so he changed the trajectory of his movement and even asked what kind of peace he should leave this place with. When all those present noticed that Caesar was coming at them again, they naturally froze in their seats in fear because they did not know what to expect from this man. Suddenly, Wilhelm's subordinate stopped a few meters away from the students and emphasized that the lighting was good and that he would own the place. The coach, of course, did not like this fact, so he quickly jumped to his feet and shouted that it was simply not possible while he was still alive. Immediately after saying these words, the gray-haired gentleman turned to his disciples and ordered them to take the life of this monster at any cost. At this time, at Thomas's estate, Lena decided that the boss should decide whether he wants to have fun with Cled, who clearly has a very big heart. Wilhelm did not know what to do, so rubbing his beard, he first thanked the assistant for being so attentive and caring towards him. However, this did not calm the girl down, but rather angered her even more, and she continued to scream, while the boss tried to figure out what the lady meant. Suddenly, the manager broke away from this emotional exchange and turned his head to Cled and asked her what she thought about the situation. The young lady again looked at the interlocutor with an unusual look and then smiled sweetly and said that he was quite a good man. The system decided to explain the words to Wilhelm a little bit, so it told him that not being so bad means that you are just an ordinary man. Suddenly, after these words, Lena calmed down and went up to Cled and put her hands on her shoulder, saying that it was too much and that she might lose interest. The boss was so absorbed in his thoughts that they did not leave him alone, and this gave him a terrible headache that felt like it was going to explode. It was at this time that Caesar was dealing with the students who were attacking him from different directions one by one in order to fulfill the coach's order. As soon as he realized that he wanted to rest a little, he grabbed his sword and struck the floor with it, creating a small earthquake and destroying the flat floor. A second later, a powerful explosion occurred, after which it became clear that Caesar had won, and his characteristics were gradually increasing. And what Caesar did raised the profile of the Black Mountain Association by 50%.